As the day's demands begin to recede and the world outside softens into twilight, we invite you to find a quiet space. Let your thoughts gently drift, allowing the rhythm of this narration to guide you toward a state of peaceful contemplation. Tonight, we will journey through time, a slow and deliberate exploration of a life that unfolded centuries ago. There is no urgency in this telling, only a steady progression, like the turning of pages in a very old book, each one revealing a fragment of a bygone era. Allow your mind to relax, to release the day's various currents. We are simply observers, tracing the contours of history, not with a need for speed, but with a quiet appreciation for the intricate tapestry of human experience. This is a story to unfold at its own pace, a narrative designed to soothe rather than excite. It is an opportunity to immerse oneself in the past, to listen as the whispers of history begin to emerge, subtle and profound. Our focus for this extended reflection will be on the life of Galileo Galilei, a name that resonates with the quiet hum of discovery and intellectual pursuit. We will not rush through the moments of his existence, but rather allow them to settle, to be absorbed in a gentle, unhurried manner. Imagine the passage of time as a slow river, carrying us steadily onward, revealing the landscape of his world, his thoughts, and his contributions, one calm current at a time. Settle in now, and let the journey begin. Our journey begins in the year 1564, within the ancient walls of Pisa, a city nestled in the heart of Tuscany, Italy. It was here, in February of that year, that Galileo Galilei first drew breath. Pisa, at that time, was a vibrant yet not overly bustling city of the Italian Renaissance. One can imagine the slow rhythm of daily life, the distant tolling of church bells marking the hours, the gentle murmur of conversations echoing from sun-drenched piazzas, and the soft sounds of artisans at their craft. The air would have carried the scent of baking bread, the damp earth from the Arno River, and perhaps the faint sweet perfume of blossoming citrus. Stone buildings, weathered by centuries, stood as silent witnesses to the flow of human activity. Merchants would have been setting out their wares, students making their way to the university, and families tending to their daily routines. It was a world illuminated by candlelight and the shifting patterns of natural light, a world where news travelled slowly, carried by word of mouth or by riders on dusty roads. This was an era of profound intellectual awakening, a time when ancient ideas were being re-examined and new thoughts were beginning to stir across Europe. Though the grand pronouncements of the Renaissance might seem distant, they formed the subtle backdrop to the everyday existence in a city like Pisa. The foundations of modern thought were slowly being laid, brick by quiet brick, in the minds of scholars and thinkers. Into this world, with its blend of tradition and nascent change, Galileo was born, a tiny, unassuming presence in a city steeped in history and quiet grandeur. His arrival was but a ripple in the calm waters of the Arno, yet it marked the beginning of a life that would, in time, profoundly alter our understanding of the cosmos. While Galileo's early life unfolded within a household rich in both artistic expression and intellectual curiosity. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a figure of considerable renown in the musical world of his time. More than just a performer, Vincenzo was a distinguished lutenist, composer, and, significantly, a profound music theorist. His work delved deeply into the mathematical underpinnings of harmony and dissonance, challenging established musical conventions through empirical observation and experimentation. He questioned the purely theoretical approaches of his predecessors, preferring to test hypotheses through the careful manipulation of strings and weights, meticulously observing the resulting sounds. Galileo's mother was Giulia Ammannati, whose presence provided the stability and warmth of a family home, and allowing the intellectual currents to flow freely. The Galilei residence would have been filled with the sounds of music, the strumming of the lute, and likely the quiet, focused discussions of Vincenzo's analytical pursuits. Imagine the young Galileo observing his father's methodical approach to understanding the physics of sound, the precise adjustments, the careful measurements, the detailed recording of observations. This was not merely the practice of an art form, it was an early lesson in the scientific method, long before such a term was formally coined. Vincenzo's influence on his son was subtle yet profound. He instilled a deep respect for direct experience over unquestioned dogma, a willingness to challenge authority with evidence, and an inclination towards quantitative analysis. While Galileo would ultimately turn his gaze from the vibrations of lute strings to the movements of celestial bodies, the foundational principles he absorbed from his father's work in acoustics, the importance of observation, measurement, and mathematical reasoning, would become cornerstones of his own revolutionary scientific endeavours. The home was not merely a place of comfort, it was a crucible of intellectual formation, preparing the young Galileo for the path he would eventually forge. In the early 1570s, a significant change in scenery occurred for the Galilei family, marking a new chapter in young Galileo's formative years. They relocated from Pisa to Florence, a city that, even then, resonated with a distinct cultural vibrancy. Pisa, with its leaning tower and ancient university, possessed a certain quiet dignity, a scholarly air rooted in tradition. Florence, however, was a different entity altogether. Florence at this time stood as a radiant jewel of the Italian Renaissance. It was not merely a city, but a crucible where art, philosophy, and nascent scientific inquiry converged and flourished with an unparalleled intensity. Here the Medici family had long cultivated an environment that encouraged innovation and intellectual pursuit. Masterpieces of painting, sculpture, and architecture adorned its squares and palaces, testaments to an era of profound creative genius. The city's streets buzzed with scholars, artists, merchants, and thinkers, all contributing to a dynamic intellectual ferment. For a young mind like Galileo's, moving from the more sedate academic atmosphere of Pisa to the energetic heart of Florentine culture would have been a stimulating experience. While Pisa offered a foundation of classical learning, Florence presented a living, breathing testament to the power of human ingenuity and exploration. It was a place where new ideas were discussed in public squares and private salons, where the boundaries of knowledge were constantly being pushed. The air itself seemed charged with a spirit of inquiry and discovery. This shift immersed Galileo in an environment where the grand achievements of the Renaissance were not merely historical facts, but living realities. He would have been exposed to the latest artistic trends, the most current philosophical debates, and the lingering echoes of great minds like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, whose legacies still permeated the city. Florence provided a rich backdrop against which Galileo's own intellectual journey would continue to unfold, subtly shaping his perceptions and broadening his horizons beyond the more structured academic world of his birthplace. The late 16th century in Italy was a period woven with intricate threads of continuity and profound change, a true tapestry of human endeavour. It was a time when the echoes of the High Renaissance still resonated powerfully, yet new currents of thought were steadily gaining momentum. The intellectual landscape was rich and complex, a fertile ground for the kind of innovative thinking that would come to define Galileo's era. The spirit of the Renaissance, which had flowered across Italy in previous centuries, continued to inspire. This era had been characterized by a profound rediscovery of classical antiquity. Ancient Greek and Roman texts, long dormant or only partially understood, were meticulously translated, studied, and disseminated. This re-engagement with classical philosophy, mathematics, and literature provided a powerful impetus for challenging medieval scholasticism and fostered a renewed confidence in human reason and observation. Scholars and artists alike drew inspiration from these ancient sources, seeking to emulate and often surpass the achievements of the past. Alongside this classical revival, there was a burgeoning, almost insatiable interest in art, science, and philosophy. Patrons, like the powerful families of Florence, actively supported artists and thinkers, recognizing the value of intellectual and creative pursuits not only for prestige but also for the advancement of knowledge itself. Anatomical studies, botanical observations, and early experiments in physics were beginning to emerge from the shadows of alchemy and pure speculation, laying groundwork for more rigorous scientific methodologies. The political landscape, while fragmented into various city-states, duchies, and papal territories, also played a role in this intellectual flourishing. Competition among these entities often spurred cultural and scientific patronage, as each sought to distinguish itself through the brilliance of its artists and scholars. While wars and diplomatic maneuverings were constant features, they did not entirely stifle the intellectual curiosity that permeated society. This was a world poised on the cusp of significant shifts, where the reverence for ancient wisdom was slowly beginning to yield to a new emphasis on direct observation and empirical evidence. It was within this rich and evolving cultural milieu, steeped in both the glories of the past and the stirrings of a new future, that Galileo Galilei spent his formative years, absorbing the prevailing currents of thought that would ultimately shape his revolutionary contributions to science. In the intellectual climate of Galileo's youth, and indeed for many centuries prior, the prevailing understanding of the cosmos and the physical world was overwhelmingly shaped by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. His ideas, meticulously elaborated and integrated into Christian theology by medieval scholars, formed the bedrock of accepted scientific and philosophical thought. This grand Aristotelian paradigm provided a comprehensive framework for explaining nearly every observable phenomenon, from the motion of the planets to the behavior of falling objects here on Earth. At its core, Aristotelian cosmology posited a geocentric or Earth-centered universe. The Earth, imperfect and mutable, was believed to reside motionless at the very center of the cosmos. Surrounding it were a series of concentric crystalline spheres, each carrying a celestial body: the moon, the sun, the known planets, and finally, the sphere of the fixed stars. Beyond this outermost sphere lay the empyrean heaven, the abode of God. The celestial realm, unlike the terrestrial, was deemed perfect, unchanging, and composed of an ethereal fifth element called ether. The motions of the heavenly bodies were believed to be eternal and perfectly circular, a reflection of their divine nature. On Earth, Aristotelian physics explained motion through the concept of natural place. Every element, earth, water, air, and fire, was believed to possess an inherent tendency to move towards its natural place in the cosmos. Earth and water naturally sought the center, which was why objects fell downwards, or water flowed to the lowest point. Air and fire, being lighter, naturally ascended. This explained why smoke rose and stones fell. Any motion that deviated from an object's natural tendency was considered violent motion, and required a continuous external force to sustain it. For instance, a thrown object would only continue to move as long as it was being pushed by the air disturbed by the throw. This system was internally coherent and had the virtue of aligning with common sense observations. It provided a stable and widely accepted model for understanding the universe, supported by centuries of scholarly tradition and theological interpretation. It was against this deeply entrenched and intellectually dominant Aristotelian framework that Galileo Galilei, with his empirical spirit and mathematical approach, would eventually bring forth his revolutionary observations and arguments. The task of challenging such a pervasive and authoritative worldview would prove to be immense, requiring not only keen intellect but also profound courage. As Galileo transitioned from the early influences of his family and the vibrant Florentine environment, his formal education began to take shape. For a period, he was sent to study at the Camaldolese monastery of Santa Maria di Vallombrosa, nestled in the tranquil hills near Florence. This was a common path for young men of his social standing, offering a rigorous curriculum and a structured environment for intellectual development. At Vallombrosa, Galileo was immersed in a traditional monastic education, which emphasized a deep engagement with classical texts. He would have studied Latin and Greek, the languages of ancient learning, meticulously translating and analyzing the works of revered authors from antiquity. This exposure was not merely linguistic, it was an introduction to the vast philosophical, literary, and historical heritage that formed the foundation of Western thought. He encountered the logical structures of Aristotle, the mathematical principles of Euclid, and the rhetorical arts of Cicero, all through the lens of a monastic curriculum designed to cultivate intellectual discipline and spiritual reflection. The monastic setting, with its routines and focus, inadvertently fostered certain habits that would prove invaluable to Galileo's later scientific endeavours. The emphasis on careful reading, precise interpretation, and systematic study, though applied to theological and classical subjects, honed his capacity for meticulous observation and analytical thought. He learned to dissect arguments, identify underlying assumptions, and appreciate the power of reasoned discourse. While the curriculum did not yet direct him toward empirical science in the modern sense, it cultivated a mind accustomed to examining details and seeking underlying order. Indeed, Galileo initially considered entering the Camaldolese order as a monk, drawn by the intellectual peace and scholarly pursuits offered by the monastic life. This inclination, however, was not to last. His father, Vincenzo, had other plans for his eldest son, envisioning a future in medicine, a more lucrative and practical profession. Despite this shift in direction, the foundations laid at Vallombrosa, the discipline of classical learning, the exposure to rigorous thought, and the quiet cultivation of an inquisitive mind, remained an enduring part of Galileo's intellectual formation. They were early seeds of inquiry, nurtured in a monastic garden that would eventually blossom into groundbreaking scientific exploration. In the year 1581, at the age of 17, Galileo Galilei enrolled at the University of Pisa. This was not entirely by his own design, but rather a direct fulfillment of his father Vincenzo's wishes. Vincenzo, a practical man despite his artistic sensibilities, understood the financial realities of their time. A career in music, while esteemed, did not offer the same steady security as the established professions. Thus, Galileo was sent to Pisa with the explicit intention of studying medicine. The University of Pisa, a venerable institution with a long history, was a significant centre of learning in Tuscany. Its medical faculty adhered to a curriculum that was largely traditional, rooted deeply in the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates. Students were expected to master the classical theories of anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology, yet often through lectures and textual analysis rather than extensive practical dissection or clinical observation. The prevailing medical philosophy emphasized humoral theory, which posited that health was maintained by a balance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was understood as an imbalance in these humours, and treatment aimed to restore equilibrium. For young Galileo, this academic path presented a distinct set of expectations. He was to diligently attend lectures, memorize complex anatomical terms, and absorb the established medical wisdom that had been passed down through centuries. The rigour was intellectual, demanding a capacity for rote learning and the assimilation of vast amounts of inherited knowledge. There was less emphasis on independent inquiry or challenging existing paradigms within the medical field itself, as the curriculum was designed to transmit established knowledge rather than to foster innovation. While his father's aspirations were clear, Galileo's own inclinations, nurtured by his earlier experiences and an innate curiosity, would soon begin to diverge from this prescribed course. The university setting, however, provided him with a broader intellectual landscape, exposing him to various disciplines and the prevailing academic methodologies of his era. Though committed to medicine by his father's decree, the seeds of a different intellectual passion were quietly taking root within him, waiting for the right moment to flourish. The hallowed halls of Pisa, intended to shape a physician, would instead become the unexpected crucible for a future natural philosopher. While pursuing his medical studies at the University of Pisa, a pivotal shift occurred in Galileo's intellectual journey. It was not through the formal curriculum, but rather through a fortunate happenstance that a new path began to reveal itself. This turning point involved Ostilio Ricci, a family friend and a distinguished mathematician. Ricci, who had served as a lecturer in mathematics at the Florentine Accademia del Disegno, was known for his practical applications of Euclidean geometry and his clear, systematic approach to problems. Ricci's presence at Pisa, perhaps for a visit or a temporary engagement, brought him into contact with the young Galileo. It is said that Galileo, perhaps out of politeness or genuine interest, began to attend some of Ricci's informal lectures or demonstrations on geometry. What began as a casual encounter soon blossomed into a profound intellectual awakening for Galileo. The world of medicine, with its reliance on ancient texts and often speculative theories, had failed to fully captivate his inquisitive mind. The subject felt less about direct observation and more about the interpretation of established dogma. But mathematics, as presented by Ricci, offered something entirely different. It was a realm of pure reason, where conclusions were not based on authority or tradition, but on irrefutable logic and precise deduction. The elegance of Euclidean proofs, where each step followed inevitably from the last, resonated deeply with Galileo's inherent desire for clarity and certainty. The abstract beauty of numbers and shapes, and the way they could describe the physical world with astonishing accuracy, began to exert a powerful pull on his intellect. He found himself drawn to the absolute certainty that mathematical reasoning provided. In mathematics, a proposition was either demonstrably true or demonstrably false. There was no room for ambiguity or subjective interpretation. This stark contrast to the often vague and debated principles of medicine was exhilarating. The rigorous structure of mathematical thought, the ability to build complex understanding from simple self-evident axioms, presented a new way of engaging with knowledge. This chance encounter with Ostilio Ricci thus served as a powerful catalyst. Galileo's initial, perhaps lukewarm engagement with medicine began to wane. He is overshadowed by a burgeoning fascination with the exactitudes of geometry and arithmetic. The allure of precise reasoning and the undeniable power of logical deduction became irresistible. It was in these early explorations of mathematics that Galileo found a language capable of describing the universe with a clarity that no other discipline for him could match. The trajectory of his life, initially set towards healing bodies, was now subtly, yet irrevocably, redirecting towards understanding the fundamental laws that govern the cosmos. Amidst his burgeoning interest in mathematics, a particular observation unfolded that would underscore Galileo's innate genius for discerning order in the natural world. This renowned incident is said to have occurred within the grand and echoing space of the Pisa Cathedral. As a young man, perhaps during a moment of quiet contemplation or distraction from a sermon, Galileo's gaze drifted upwards. There, suspended from the high ceiling, hung a large lamp, gently swaying back and forth after being lit or disturbed. To most, it would have been merely a decorative fixture moving in the air, but to Galileo, ever attuned to the subtle rhythms of the physical world, it presented a phenomenon worthy of deeper scrutiny. He noticed that regardless of how wide its initial swing, the lamp seemed to take the same amount of time to complete each oscillation. When the arc of its swing was great, it moved faster, covering the larger distance in what appeared to be the same duration as when its arc was small and its speed slower. Without the aid of any precise timekeeping device, Galileo, it is said, used his own pulse to measure these durations. He carefully noted how many beats of his heart corresponded to one complete swing of the lamp, from one side to the other and back again. What he found was remarkable, a consistent regularity and isochronism regardless of the amplitude of the swing. The pendulum, a simple weight on a string, exhibited a dependable rhythm. This observation, seemingly minor, was profound in its implications. It was an early demonstration of Galileo's keen observational abilities, his capacity to see beyond the surface of a phenomenon and discern underlying principles. It revealed a mind that sought quantifiable patterns in motion, a departure from purely qualitative descriptions. The swinging lamp was not just moving, it was moving with a measurable, predictable periodicity. This moment in the Pisa Cathedral stands as a foundational anecdote in the story of Galileo's scientific development. It marked the birth of a significant scientific idea, the principle of the pendulum's regularity. While it would be many years before this insight would find practical application in the design of clocks, the seed of understanding had been planted. It underscored his growing conviction that the universe operated according to fixed mathematical laws, discoverable through careful observation and measurement. This quiet moment, under the high arches of the cathedral, was a testament to the power of a curious mind, unafraid to question what others accepted as simply being. While Galileo's intellectual pursuits blossomed at the University of Pisa, a shadow began to lengthen over his academic future. The persistent and often unforgiving reality of financial strain. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, despite his considerable talents as a musician and theorist, faced the common challenges of supporting a large family in a time when steady income was often precarious. The costs associated with university education were substantial, representing a significant burden on the family's resources. As Galileo delved deeper into mathematics, moving away from his initial medical studies, the prospect of a lucrative and secure career, which had been his father's primary motivation for sending him to Pisa, receded. This shift, while intellectually fulfilling for Galileo, did not alleviate the family's financial pressures. In fact, it may have exacerbated them, as a mathematical career at that time did not promise the same immediate financial returns as medicine. The situation became increasingly untenable. Despite Galileo's evident brilliance and his growing reputation among a small circle of scholars, the funds simply ran out. The family could no longer afford the tuition and living expenses required for him to continue his studies. This economic reality dictated a harsh conclusion to his time at the University of Pisa. Consequently, in 1585, after 4 years of study, Galileo Galilei departed from the institution without receiving a degree. This was not a reflection of a lack of ability or commitment on his part, but rather a direct consequence of the family's inability to sustain the financial commitment. It marked an abrupt end to his formal university education, leaving him without the official credentials that were often a prerequisite for established academic positions. This period of hardship, however, did not extinguish Galileo's intellectual fire. Instead, it served to underscore his profound determination. Though lacking a degree, he carried with him a wealth of knowledge, a sharpened intellect, and a growing confidence in his own observational and mathematical abilities. The necessity of leaving Pisa without the formal recognition of a degree did not deter his pursuit of scientific understanding. It merely redirected his path, compelling him to seek alternative avenues for continuing his intellectual journey, fueled by an internal drive that transcended the immediate circumstances of financial adversity. Upon his departure from the University of Pisa, a Galileo did not abandon his intellectual pursuits. Instead, he sought practical means to sustain himself and continue his studies, turning to the field of private tutoring. This period, though necessitated by financial hardship, proved to be invaluable for his development. As a private tutor in mathematics, he had to articulate complex concepts clearly and patiently, honing his pedagogical skills and deepening his own understanding of the subjects he taught. He instructed students from affluent families, often in Florence, where his own family had relocated. This work allowed him to maintain intellectual engagement and provided a modest income, a crucial support during these years. Beyond teaching, this era also marked Galileo's early forays into the realm of invention and practical application of scientific principles. His mind was not merely content with theoretical understanding, it sought to manifest knowledge in tangible forms. One notable creation from this period was the hydrostatic balance, an instrument designed to accurately determine the specific gravity of objects. This device was an ingenious application of Archimedes' principle, allowing for the precise measurement of the purity of metals, a matter of considerable practical importance in commerce and assaying. The design of the hydrostatic balance was meticulously conceived. It involved a precise balance beam and a system for submerging objects in water, allowing for a comparison of their weight in air and in water. This invention demonstrated Galileo's keen understanding of physics and his ability to translate theoretical knowledge into a functional tool. It was not merely a clever contraption, but a scientific instrument that provided a more accurate method for a task that had previously relied on cruder techniques. These activities, both his tutoring and his inventive work, served to quietly establish his reputation beyond the confines of a formal university degree. While he lacked the official title, his practical demonstrations of mathematical and physical principles, coupled with his innovative designs, began to draw the attention of scholars and patrons. His skills were not merely academic, they were demonstrably useful and intellectually rigorous. This period of private work and early invention thus laid a crucial foundation, showcasing his practical ingenuity and intellectual depth, and slowly paving the way for future academic appointments. The quiet reputation Galileo had cultivated through his private instruction and inventive work eventually bore fruit. In 1589, a significant opportunity arose, drawing him back to the very institution he had been compelled to leave. He was appointed as a professor of mathematics at the University of Pisa. This appointment was a testament to his burgeoning intellectual standing, particularly remarkable considering he had not completed a formal degree from any university. His brilliance and practical understanding of mathematics and mechanics had, in essence, served as his credentials. The position at Pisa was not one of great prestige or high salary, but it represented a crucial turning point. It provided a steady, albeit modest, income, and more importantly, a platform within an academic setting. For Galileo, this meant an official entry into the world of scholarship, offering him the chance to dedicate his energies more fully to his mathematical interests. The university environment, with its libraries and opportunities for intellectual exchange, was a welcome change from the isolated work of private tutoring. His teaching duties at Pisa primarily involved instructing students in Euclid's geometry and the standard Ptolemaic system of astronomy. These were the established curricula of the time, forming the bedrock of mathematical and cosmological understanding. While teaching these traditional subjects, Galileo also began to formulate and test his own ideas, often finding himself at odds with the entrenched Aristotelian views prevalent in the university. His lectures, though perhaps adhering to the required curriculum, likely contained subtle seeds of his burgeoning independent thought. This return to Pisa marked a period of intense intellectual growth and early scientific inquiry. It was here that he began to critically examine the prevailing Aristotelian physics, particularly concerning motion. The quiet halls of the university, once a place of unfulfilled academic aspiration, now became the stage for his initial, more formal investigations into the nature of the physical world. The professorship provided a stable environment, allowing him to deepen his understanding and begin to challenge accepted doctrines, even if these challenges were initially confined to his own thoughts and private experiments. The appointment was a recognition of his inherent genius and a vital step in his journey as a pioneering scientist. And during his tenure at the University of Pisa, Galileo engaged with the prevailing scientific beliefs of his era, many of which were rooted in the ancient philosophy of Aristotle. A cornerstone of Aristotelian physics held that objects fell at speeds proportional to their weight. In simpler terms, a heavier object would fall faster than a lighter one. This notion had been accepted for nearly 2 millennia, largely unchallenged by direct experimental verification. It is in this context that a compelling, if perhaps apocryphal, story emerged, the tale of Galileo at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The narrative suggests that Galileo, in a dramatic public demonstration, ascended the iconic tower with 2 spheres of differing weights but similar size. From its heights, he reputedly released them simultaneously. The onlookers, accustomed to Aristotelian predictions, would have expected the heavier sphere to strike the ground significantly before the lighter one. However, according to the legend, both objects landed at the base of the tower at approximately the same moment. This simple yet profound observation, if it occurred precisely as described, would have delivered a powerful conceptual challenge to the long-held Aristotelian view of falling bodies. It suggested that weight, contrary to ancient wisdom, was not the primary determinant of an object's rate of fall, at least not in the manner previously assumed. While the historical accuracy of this specific public spectacle remains a subject of quiet debate among scholars, the underlying principle it illustrates is undeniably central to Galileo's developing understanding of motion. Whether he performed this exact public experiment or conducted similar less dramatic tests, his writings clearly indicate that he arrived at the conclusion that objects, in the absence of significant air resistance, fall with the same acceleration, irrespective of their mass. The Leaning Tower narrative, regardless of its literal truth, serves as a potent symbol of Galileo's methodological approach to question established dogma through observation and experimentation, rather than simply accepting authority. It marks a foundational step in the transition from purely philosophical speculation about the natural world to empirical investigation. This quiet act of questioning, whether performed from a famous tower or through meticulous indoor experiments, represented a profound shift in scientific thought, and gently nudging the world toward a new way of understanding the forces that govern it. In the year 1592, a significant shift occurred in Galileo's professional life. He departed from the University of Pisa and accepted a prestigious position as the chair of mathematics at the University of Padua. This move marked the beginning of what many historians consider the most fruitful and creatively vibrant period of his entire career, a span of 18 years that would profoundly shape his scientific trajectory. Padua itself was a city of considerable intellectual ferment, situated within the Venetian Republic, a state renowned for its relative openness and its pragmatic approach to scholarship. Unlike the more rigid academic environments found elsewhere, often constrained by ecclesiastical oversight, the Venetian Republic fostered a climate of intellectual freedom and inquiry. This unique atmosphere provided Galileo with an ideal setting to explore his ideas without the same pressures he might have faced in other regions of Italy. The University of Padua was a distinguished institution, attracting scholars and students from across Europe. Its faculty embraced a diverse range of subjects, and the exchange of ideas was encouraged, creating a fertile ground for innovation. For Galileo, this meant access to a wide array of colleagues, rich libraries, and the resources necessary for both theoretical and practical investigations. He found himself amidst a community that valued learning and inquiry, allowing his intellect to flourish with fewer impediments. This period in Padua was characterized not only by academic freedom, but also by a more stable financial footing for Galileo. His salary was considerably higher than what he had earned in Pisa, providing him with a degree of security that enabled him to focus more intently on his research and teaching. He established a household, took on private students, and actively engaged with the vibrant cultural life of the city. The blend of intellectual liberty, a supportive academic community, and increased personal stability created an environment where Galileo could dedicate himself fully to his scientific passions. It was during these years that he would delve deeply into mechanics, further refine his understanding of motion, and begin to lay the groundwork for some of his most significant astronomical discoveries. The quiet hum of the Paduan workshops and lecture halls became the backdrop for a period of intense creativity and profound intellectual growth, a golden era that would shape the future course of science. During his tenure at Padua, Galileo quickly established himself as a captivating and highly sought-after lecturer. His classroom was often filled to capacity, a testament to his engaging teaching style and his ability to articulate complex mathematical and scientific concepts with clarity. He did not merely recite established doctrines, rather he encouraged critical thinking and presented his own original insights, drawing students into the process of scientific discovery itself. His reputation grew steadily, extending beyond the academic walls. His students from noble families across Europe journeyed to Padua specifically to study under him, further solidifying his standing. He lectured not only on traditional mathematics, but also on practical subjects such as military architecture and fortifications, demonstrating his versatile understanding of applied science. These lectures showcased his ability to bridge theoretical knowledge with real-world applications, a skill highly valued in the Venetian Republic. Beyond the lecture hall, Galileo was deeply immersed in practical work in mechanics and engineering. He maintained a workshop in his home, a space where he could experiment, build, and refine his inventions. This hands-on approach was central to his scientific method. He designed and constructed numerous instruments, including a geometric and military compass, which was a highly practical device used for a variety of calculations in surveying, artillery, and drawing. He not only invented the instrument, but also wrote a manual for its use, demonstrating his commitment to the practical dissemination of knowledge. His work during this period also encompassed extensive investigations into the principles of motion, hydrostatics, and the strength of materials. He conducted experiments with inclined planes, further developing his understanding of acceleration and the behavior of falling bodies. These practical explorations were not isolated endeavors, but were deeply intertwined with his theoretical insights, each informing the other. Galileo's Paduan years were thus a rich tapestry of teaching, invention, and rigorous empirical investigation, laying a robust foundation for the groundbreaking astronomical observations that would eventually follow. Galileo's most profound contributions during his Paduan years, though not fully published until much later, lay in his systematic exploration of motion. Prior to his work, the prevailing Aristotelian view held that objects naturally sought a state of rest, and that heavier objects fell faster than lighter ones. Galileo meticulously challenged these assumptions, ushering in a new era of physics based on observation and mathematical description. His brilliant innovation was to slow down the phenomenon of falling. Direct observation of freely falling objects was difficult due to their rapid acceleration. To overcome this, Galileo devised ingenious experiments using inclined planes. He would roll smooth bronze balls down carefully grooved wooden ramps, whose gentle slopes allowed him to dilute the effect of gravity, making the motion slow enough to be accurately measured. With these inclined planes, Galileo was able to precisely measure the distance travelled by the ball at regular intervals of time. He used a water clock, a large vessel from which water flowed steadily into a small cup to mark time. By weighing the water collected during specific durations, he could achieve a remarkable degree of accuracy for his era. Through countless repetitions and careful analysis of his data, Galileo discovered a fundamental relationship. The distance an object travels under constant acceleration is proportional to the square of the time elapsed. This meant that if an object travelled a certain distance in 1 unit of time, it would travel 4 times that distance in 2 units of time, and 9 times that distance in 3 units of time. This quadratic relationship between distance and time for uniformly accelerated motion was a revolutionary insight. It directly contradicted the Aristotelian notion that speed was proportional to distance and time. Galileo's experiments revealed that objects accelerate uniformly, meaning their speed increases by the same amount in each successive unit of time, regardless of their weight. This concept of uniform acceleration was a cornerstone of what would later become classical mechanics. Furthermore, his work hinted at the principle of inertia, the idea that an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force. While Isaac Newton would later fully formalize this concept, Galileo's experiments on inclined planes and his thought experiments concerning ideal frictionless surfaces laid the essential groundwork. His rigorous, quantitative approach to studying motion marked a profound shift from philosophical speculation to empirical science, forever changing humanity's understanding of how the physical world operates. From his careful studies of motion on inclined planes, Galileo began to formulate an idea that would fundamentally alter the understanding of how objects move in the universe. This was the principle of inertia, a concept profoundly at odds with the long-held Aristotelian worldview. Aristotle's physics posited that objects naturally sought a state of rest. For an object to remain in motion, it required a continuous force pushing or pulling it. Once that force ceased, the object would inevitably slow down and stop. This seemed to align with everyday experience. A cart stops when not pushed, a thrown stone eventually falls. Galileo, however, began to think differently. He considered what would happen if the friction on his inclined planes were entirely eliminated, or if an object were placed on a perfectly smooth horizontal surface. He reasoned that if a ball rolled down an inclined plane, it would accelerate. If it rolled up an inclined plane, it would decelerate. But what if the plane were perfectly horizontal? In such an ideal scenario, where there was no upward slope to slow it down, and no downward slope to speed it up, Galileo reasoned that the ball would continue to move at a constant speed, indefinitely, in a straight line, provided no external forces acted upon it. This was a radical departure. Yet it suggested that motion itself was as natural a state as rest. An object, once set in motion, possessed an inherent tendency to maintain that motion. It did not require a continuous force to keep it moving. Rather, a force was only necessary to change its state of motion, to speed it up, slow it down, or alter its direction. While Galileo did not explicitly state the principle in the precise, universal terms later articulated by Isaac Newton, his experiments and thought processes clearly established the intellectual foundation for it. He understood that friction and air resistance were external forces that caused objects to slow down in the real world, and that in their absence uniform motion would persist. This profound insight laid crucial groundwork for understanding not only terrestrial mechanics, but also the celestial motions of planets and stars. It was a pivotal step towards a universe governed by mathematical laws rather than inherent teleological tendencies. Galileo's inventive spirit was not confined solely to theoretical physics or astronomical observations. He also applied his ingenuity to the creation of practical devices, instruments designed to measure and quantify aspects of the natural world that had previously been described only qualitatively. Among these early innovations was the thermoscope, an important precursor to the modern thermometer. This instrument, developed around the turn of the 17th century, was a testament to Galileo's commitment to empirical observation and his desire to bring precision to scientific inquiry. The thermoscope typically consisted of a small glass bulb with a long slender neck extending downwards into a container of water or wine. As the air within the bulb heated or cooled, it would expand or contract, causing the liquid in the tube to rise or fall. While not a thermometer in the strict sense, it lacked a standardized scale for absolute temperature measurement. The thermoscope allowed for the observation of relative changes in heat. One could discern whether a substance or environment was becoming warmer or cooler compared to a previous state. This marked a significant step beyond mere sensation, providing a visual, repeatable indication of thermal variation. The thermoscope exemplified Galileo's broader approach to science. The belief that understanding the world required not just intellectual contemplation, but also careful measurement and the construction of tools to aid in that measurement. Before Galileo, discussions of heat often relied on subjective human perception. With the thermoscope, even in its rudimentary form, a path was open to objectify and compare thermal states. This invention underscored a crucial aspect of the emerging scientific method: the importance of instrumentation in extending human senses and providing quantitative data. Whether designing compasses for military use or creating a device to gauge the warmth of the air, Galileo consistently sought to bridge the gap between abstract thought and tangible, measurable reality. The thermoscope, in its quiet utility, stands as an early symbol of this enduring commitment to empirical science. Beyond his theoretical work and more conceptual instruments like the thermoscope, Galileo also applied his considerable mathematical and mechanical skills to create highly practical tools with immediate commercial value. Among his most successful inventions was the geometric and military compass, sometimes referred to as a sector. This versatile device, perfected around 1597, became a significant source of income and extended his reputation beyond academic circles. The compass was an intricate instrument, a pair of hinged rulers marked with various scales for different mathematical and geometric operations. It was designed to simplify complex calculations for a wide range of users, from architects and engineers to artillerymen and merchants. Yet for military applications, it could quickly determine the proper elevation for a cannon to hit a target, calculate the number of cannonballs needed for a specific caliber, or measure distances on maps. Its geometric scales allowed for the rapid division of lines, calculation of proportions, and conversion between different units of measurement. Galileo not only designed the compass, but also established a workshop in his home to manufacture and sell them, personally overseeing the production and quality. He recognized the need for clear instruction, and to that end, he authored a detailed manual explaining its use. This manual was printed in 1606 and further enhanced the instrument's appeal and accessibility. The success of the geometric and military compass provided Galileo with a valuable independent income, supplementing his professorial salary. This financial stability was crucial, especially given his growing family responsibilities. More than just a monetary gain, the compass brought him further recognition as a skilled inventor and practical mathematician, attracting students and patrons who valued his ability to apply abstract principles to real-world problems. Its widespread adoption across Europe solidified his reputation as a master of both theoretical and applied science, demonstrating his unique talent for bridging the gap between intellectual pursuit and tangible utility. While Galileo's professional life in Padua was marked by intense scientific inquiry and mechanical innovation, his personal life during this period also developed in significant ways. It was in Padua that he entered into a relationship with Marina Gamba, a woman from Venice. Though they never married, as was not uncommon for individuals of differing social strata at the time, their union was enduring and resulted in the birth of 3 children. Their first child, Virginia, was born in August of 1600. She was followed by Livia in 1601, and then their only son, Vincenzo, who arrived in 1606. Marina Gamba remained with Galileo throughout his time in Padua, managing his household and caring for their children. Her presence provided a domestic foundation amidst the demanding schedule of a university professor, inventor, and private tutor. The precise details of Marina Gamba's background are not extensively documented in historical records, consistent with the general lack of detailed information available for women of her social standing during that era. However, her role in Galileo's life was undeniably important, as she was the mother of his children and an integral part of his household for many years. Galileo's feelings and perspectives on this relationship are not extensively recorded in his surviving personal correspondence or scientific writings, which typically focused on his intellectual pursuits. Nevertheless, the existence of his 3 children with Marina Gamba is a clear testament to this period of his life in Padua. The children were raised in his home, and their future would become a notable aspect of Galileo's later years, particularly the paths taken by his daughters. This familial dimension ran quietly alongside his public contributions to science, forming a private aspect of his existence during these productive years in Padua. As Galileo continued his work in physics and invention during his time in Padua, a different, quieter shift was occurring in the realm of cosmological thought, a shift that had begun decades earlier with the work of Nicholas Copernicus. The Polish astronomer had, in 1543, published his seminal work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, or On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. This book introduced a radical idea that challenged the long-held geocentric view of the universe, a view that placed Earth immovably at its centre. Copernicus proposed a heliocentric model, a system where the Sun, not the Earth, resided at the centre of the cosmos. In this new arrangement, the Earth, along with the other planets, was depicted as orbiting the Sun. Furthermore, Copernicus suggested that the Earth also rotated on its own axis, accounting for the apparent daily motion of the stars across the sky. This model offered a more elegant and mathematically simpler explanation for the observed movements of celestial bodies, particularly the retrograde motion of planets, which appeared to move backward in the sky for periods. However, at the time of its publication and for many decades thereafter, Copernicanism remained largely a mathematical hypothesis. It was viewed by many as a clever computational tool, a way to simplify astronomical calculations rather than a description of physical reality. The prevailing Aristotelian and Ptolemaic systems with their Earth-centered universe, were deeply ingrained in both scientific and theological thought. These traditional views aligned with everyday human experience and were supported by centuries of philosophical and religious doctrine. Consequently, the heliocentric model was not widely accepted. It lacked direct observational proof that could convincingly overturn the established order. The concept of a moving Earth, spinning through space and revolving around the Sun, was difficult to reconcile with common sense and existing physical theories, which struggled to explain how objects would not fly off a rapidly moving planet. Thus, the whispers of a new cosmos, though articulated by Copernicus, awaited further evidence and a more forceful champion to truly challenge the entrenched understanding of the universe. As the first decade of the 17th century drew to a close, a remarkable piece of news began to travel across Europe. Whispering of an invention that promised to transform human sight. In 1609, reports reached Italy about a novel optical instrument developed in the Netherlands, a device known as a spyglass. This simple yet revolutionary apparatus, created by combining lenses, possessed the astonishing ability to make distant objects appear closer and larger. The initial applications of this spyglass were primarily military. It was immediately recognized for its potential on battlefields and at sea, allowing commanders to observe enemy movements from afar, identify ships on the horizon, or survey fortifications with unprecedented clarity. The strategic advantage it offered was immense, and its existence quickly became a matter of considerable interest to various European powers. However, beyond its immediate military utility, the very idea of such an instrument sparked a deeper sense of excitement among those with a curiosity for the natural world. The ability to magnify distant objects suggested possibilities far beyond earthly battlefields. What else could this spyglass reveal if turned towards the heavens? What secrets might it unlock if directed at the moon, the planets, or the myriad stars that dotted the night sky? For centuries, human understanding of the cosmos had been limited by the naked eye. Observations, though painstaking and precise for their time, could only discern what was visible without aid. The arrival of the Dutch spyglass hinted at a profound expansion of this observational frontier. It represented not merely a new tool for warfare, but a potential gateway to entirely new realms of perception and discovery, where the implications for astronomy, for challenging long-held beliefs about the universe, were immense, even if not yet fully grasped by all. The instrument itself was a testament to the ingenuity of its creators, but its true power lay in the unforeseen horizons it promised to unveil. The news of the Dutch spyglass, with its modest magnifying power, quickly captured Galileo's keen intellect. He recognized immediately that this rudimentary device held immense promise, far beyond its initial military applications. Unlike many who simply marveled at the novelty, Galileo set about understanding its underlying principles and, more importantly, improving upon them. With characteristic intensity, he embarked on a mission to construct his own version, but with significantly enhanced capabilities. He did not merely copy the Dutch design, yet he sought to transform it. Galileo possessed a profound understanding of optics and geometry, which he now applied with meticulous dedication. His workshop in Padua became a crucible of experimentation, filled with glass blanks, grinding tools and polishing compounds. He began by acquiring spectacle lenses, the common optical components of his era, and experimenting with various combinations. However, the quality of these commercially available lenses was insufficient for his ambitious goals. To achieve the clarity and magnification he envisioned, Galileo knew he had to craft his own. He immersed himself in the painstaking art of lens grinding and polishing, a skill that demanded immense patience, precision, and an almost intuitive feel for the material. Galileo developed his own techniques for shaping glass into curved surfaces, and meticulously grinding and polishing them to achieve the perfect curvature and smoothness. This was a slow, labour-intensive process, requiring hours of repetitive motion and constant refinement. He experimented tirelessly with different types of glass and varying focal lengths, driven by an unwavering commitment to optical perfection. His efforts soon yielded remarkable results. Within a matter of months, Galileo had surpassed the performance of the original Dutch spyglass. His early instruments achieved magnifications of around 3 or 4 times, but through relentless effort, he swiftly developed telescopes that could magnify objects 9, then 20, and eventually even 30 times. The images produced were not only larger, but also significantly clearer and brighter than anything previously achieved. This was no longer merely a spyglass. It was a true telescope, an instrument transformed by Galileo's genius and dedication. With his newly perfected instrument in hand, capable of revealing distant terrestrial objects with unprecedented clarity, Galileo stood at a pivotal moment. The practical applications of his telescope were immediately apparent and commercially valuable. He demonstrated it to Venetian merchants and officials who quickly grasped its military and navigational utility, offering him a lifetime appointment and a raise at Padua. Yet, while these earthly benefits were significant, Galileo's scientific curiosity pulled him in a different direction. The sky, long a domain of philosophical speculation and mathematical prediction, now presented itself as a realm ripe for direct observation. No human eye had ever truly seen the celestial bodies in such detail. The traditional view of the cosmos, inherited from Aristotle and Ptolemy, described a perfect, unchanging heavens, distinct from the mutable earth. This ancient understanding had persisted for centuries, largely unchallenged by empirical evidence that could definitively prove or disprove its tenets. Galileo, however, possessed a tool that promised to bridge the gap between theoretical models and observable reality. The decision to point his telescope upwards, towards the moon, the planets, and the myriad stars, was not merely a casual act of curiosity. It was a profound shift in human perception, marking the true beginning of telescopic astronomy. It was an act born of a deep scientific impulse, thus an understanding that the universe held secrets waiting to be unveiled by direct scrutiny. As he first aimed his instrument at the night sky, a sense of profound wonder must have enveloped him. The familiar points of light, long observed and catalogued, would now resolve into something more complex, more detailed, and potentially far more revealing than anyone had ever imagined. The clarity and magnification offered by his telescope promised an entirely new perspective, an unprecedented opportunity to peer beyond the veil of naked eye observation and into the very fabric of the cosmos. This was a moment pregnant with possibility, a quiet turning point in intellectual history. The heavens, once an abstract tapestry of philosophical constructs, were about to become a landscape waiting to be explored, charted, and understood through empirical evidence. The implications of such observations were vast, promising to challenge deeply held beliefs and reshape humanity's understanding of its place within the universe. The silent act of pointing a lens towards the stars heralded the dawn of a new era of scientific discovery. Among Galileo's very first celestial observations, the moon presented itself as a subject of immediate and profound interest. Through the lens of his telescope, the familiar, seemingly smooth disk began to reveal an entirely new topography. He discerned not a perfect, unblemished sphere, but a surface marked by distinct irregularities. As the terminator, the line separating lunar day from night, slowly progressed across the moon's face, Galileo observed shadows lengthening and shortening, just as they would on Earth when cast by mountains and valleys. He meticulously sketched what he saw, depicting dark areas that he called seas and lighter regions that rose above them. The edges of these lighter areas, particularly along the terminator, were uneven and jagged. He noted bright points of light appearing in the dark, unilluminated portions of the moon, which he correctly interpreted as the sun's rays striking the peaks of towering lunar mountains, much like sunrise illuminating earthly summits. Galileo even attempted to estimate the heights of these lunar mountains by measuring the lengths of their shadows. His calculations, though rudimentary, suggested that some of these celestial peaks were comparable in scale to the tallest mountains on Earth. This observation was revolutionary because it directly contradicted the long-held Aristotelian cosmological view, which posited that all celestial bodies were perfect, immutable spheres, composed of an ethereal, unchanging quintessence. Aristotle's heavens were supposed to be pristine, free from the imperfections and changeability that characterize the Earth. Galileo's telescopic revelation of mountains and valleys on the moon shattered this ancient dogma. It suggested that the moon was not fundamentally different from Earth. It possessed a rugged, varied surface, much like our own world. This observation began to erode the strict qualitative distinction between the terrestrial and the celestial realms, implying a greater unity in the universe than previously conceived. The moon, once a symbol of celestial perfection, was now revealed to be a world, albeit a distant one, bearing striking resemblances to the earth beneath Galileo's feet. This was a quiet yet profound intellectual earthquake. On the evening of January 7th, 1610, Galileo turned his telescope toward Jupiter, a planet already known to the naked eye as a bright wandering star. What he observed that night, and in the subsequent evenings, would irrevocably alter humanity's understanding of the cosmos. Near Jupiter, he saw 3 small, distinct stars, arranged in a straight line with the planet. Initially, he considered them to be fixed background stars. However, his careful, methodical observations over the next few nights revealed a startling pattern. On January 8th, the stars had shifted their positions relative to Jupiter. On January 10th, he could only see 2, and by January 11th, he saw 3 again, but now on the opposite side of the planet. Galileo, with his keen observational skills and mathematical mind, quickly realized that these were not fixed stars at all. They were moving in regular orbits around Jupiter itself. Within a few days, he had confirmed the existence of 4 such celestial bodies, now known as Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. He observed their continuous dance around the giant planet, appearing and disappearing as they passed, behind or in front of Jupiter. This discovery provided undeniable empirical evidence that there were indeed celestial bodies that did not orbit the Earth. This was a direct and powerful blow to the Ptolemaic and Aristotelian geocentric model, which held that Earth was the unmoving centre of all celestial motion. If moons could orbit Jupiter, then the Earth was not the sole centre of all cosmic revolutions. This observation provided a compelling analogy for the Copernican model, where the planets, including Earth, orbited the Sun. Just as Jupiter had its own retinue of moons, the Sun could similarly be the gravitational anchor for the planets. Galileo, ever astute to the political and financial realities of his time, chose to name these newly discovered celestial bodies the Medicean stars, in honour of his former pupil and patron, Cosimo II de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. This gesture was not merely flattery, it was a strategic move to secure patronage and support for his scientific endeavours and to lend prestige to his groundbreaking work. The Medicean stars, therefore, served both as a profound scientific revelation and a testament to Galileo's practical understanding of the patronage system. their existence unequivocally demonstrated that the universe was far more complex and dynamic than ancient philosophy had allowed. Following his revolutionary observations of Jupiter's moons, Galileo continued his patient nightly vigil of the heavens. His gaze eventually settled upon Venus, the brightest object in the night sky after the moon. The planet, often referred to as the morning star or evening star, held a particular significance in astronomical models. Both the geocentric and heliocentric systems made distinct predictions about how Venus should appear when viewed through a telescope. As Galileo meticulously tracked Venus over several months, he began to discern a remarkable phenomenon. Venus, like the moon, exhibited a full range of phases. He observed it as a slender crescent, gradually waxing to a half phase, then a gibbous phase, and finally a full round disk. Crucially, he also noted a correlation between the apparent size of Venus and its phase. It appeared largest when it was a crescent and smallest when it was full. This observation was profoundly significant because it provided irrefutable empirical evidence that directly contradicted the predictions of the Ptolemaic geocentric model. In the Ptolemaic system, Venus was thought to orbit Earth on an epicycle, with the entire epicycle orbiting Earth. Within this framework, Venus would always remain between the Earth and the Sun, or nearly so. This configuration meant that Venus should primarily appear as a crescent or a partial phase, and never as a full disk, from Earth's perspective. Furthermore, its apparent size would not vary in the way Galileo observed. However, Galileo's observations of Venus's full cycle of phases, including the full phase, and the inverse relationship between its phase and apparent size perfectly matched the predictions of the Copernican heliocentric model. In the Copernican system, Venus orbits the Sun inside Earth's orbit. When Venus is on the far side of the Sun from Earth, it appears fully illuminated, much like a full moon, though smaller due to its greater distance. When it's between the Earth and the Sun, only a small crescent of its illuminated side is visible, but it appears larger because it is closer. The phases of Venus therefore provided a critical piece of observational proof for the heliocentric theory. It was a direct visual confirmation that Venus orbited the Sun, not the Earth, and that our solar system was arranged as Copernicus had proposed. This telescopic discovery was not merely an interesting curiosity. It was a powerful, undeniable argument against the prevailing geocentric worldview and a compelling validation of the Sun-centered universe. Beyond the Moon, Jupiter and Venus, Galileo turned his refined telescope towards another familiar yet enigmatic celestial feature, the Milky Way. To the naked eye, this luminous band stretching across the night sky appeared as a diffuse, milky cloud, a nebulous smear of light that had puzzled philosophers and astronomers for centuries. Ancient myths and theories often described it as a celestial river, a divine pathway, or an atmospheric phenomenon. Or when Galileo directed his telescope toward this shimmering expanse, the indistinct cloud began to resolve into something far more intricate and astonishing. What had seemed like a continuous ethereal glow was revealed to be a countless multitude of individual points of light. The milky appearance was merely the optical effect of innumerable stars, packed so densely together that their individual brilliance merged into an unbroken luminosity when viewed without magnification. Galileo meticulously documented this observation in his Sidereus Nuncius, describing how the telescope allowed him to distinguish with such clarity a congeries of stars, some of them rather large and conspicuous, but a great many more smaller. He noted that the galaxy is nothing else but a mass of innumerable stars planted together in clusters. This revelation was profound. It stripped away the mystical veil from the Milky Way, transforming it from an atmospheric oddity or a cosmic smear into a vast, unimaginably distant collection of stars, each a sun in its own right, though appearing faint due to their immense distance. this discovery significantly expanded the perceived scale of the universe. If the Milky Way was composed of countless individual stars, then the cosmos was far more capacious and populated than previously imagined. It suggested an almost infinite expanse, teeming with stellar bodies beyond the mere handful visible to the unaided eye. The universe was not just a system of planets orbiting a central body, but an immense, glittering tapestry woven from billions of distant suns. Galileo's telescopic gaze had not only brought distant worlds into focus, but it also dissolved the boundaries of the familiar night sky, unveiling a universe of breathtaking scale and complexity. The Milky Way, once a hazy enigma, now stood revealed as a testament to the sheer magnitude of the cosmos. A swarm of stars stretching beyond human comprehension. Having explored the moon's ruggedness, the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the stellar nature of the Milky Way, Galileo turned his gaze to the most dominant object in the sky, the sun itself. Observing the sun directly through a telescope was a perilous undertaking, risking permanent damage to the eye. Galileo, or his contemporaries, devised methods to project the sun's image onto a screen, allowing for safer and more detailed study. Through this method, Galileo made another discovery that further eroded the Aristotelian doctrine of celestial perfection. He observed dark blemishes on the sun's luminous surface, which he termed sunspots. These were not fleeting shadows from unseen bodies, nor were they imperfections in his telescope. Instead, they appeared to be intrinsic features of the sun itself. What was even more significant than their mere existence was their behaviour. Galileo meticulously tracked these sunspots over extended periods. He noticed that they were not stationary, but moved across the sun's disk. They would appear on one limb, slowly traverse the face of the sun, and then disappear on the opposite limb, only to reappear on the initial limb after a certain interval. This systematic movement could only be explained if the sunspots were features on the sun's surface, and the sun itself was rotating on an axis. This observation was another powerful blow to the long-held belief in the immaculate and unchanging nature of celestial bodies. According to Aristotelian cosmology, the heavens were composed of perfect, unblemished, and immutable spheres. The sun, as a celestial body, was presumed to be without blemish, a perfect orb of pure light. Galileo's sunspot observations presented clear evidence to the contrary. The sun, like the moon, possessed irregularities. It was not a flawless, static sphere, but a dynamic body with observable features and a rotational motion. These dark marks on the sun's brilliant face further unified the terrestrial and celestial realms, suggesting that the heavens were not fundamentally different from Earth in their composition or behaviour. The sun, too, exhibited change and movement, reflecting a more complex and interconnected cosmos than previously conceived. The cumulative weight of Galileo's telescopic discoveries, each one a profound revelation, demanded to be shared with the wider world. He meticulously compiled his observations, sketches, and conclusions into a slender Latin treatise, which he published in Venice in March of 1610. He titled this work Sidereus Nuncius, or The Starry Messenger. This book was not merely a scientific report. It was a dramatic announcement, a dispatch from the new frontier of the cosmos. In its pages, Galileo laid bare the imperfections of the moon, describing its mountains and valleys. He revealed the multitude of stars hidden within the Milky Way. Most strikingly, he presented the 4 new Medicean stars orbiting Jupiter, a direct, observable refutation of the geocentric principle that everything revolved around Earth. The phases of Venus and the movements of sunspots, though perhaps not fully detailed in this initial publication, were part of the broader intellectual ferment it ignited. The impact of Sidereus Nuncius was immediate and electrifying. Copies circulated rapidly across Europe, translated and discussed in universities, courts, and intellectual salons. The book was a sensation, captivating minds from astronomers and philosophers to princes and prelates. It was a testament to the power of direct observation, offering tangible proof of a universe far more complex and dynamic than had ever been imagined. The excitement it generated was palpable. Scholars across the continent scrambled to acquire telescopes and verify Galileo's claims. Some were skeptical, refusing to believe that an instrument could reveal such truths, or that the heavens could be so different from what ancient wisdom dictated. Others, however, were enthralled, seeing in Galileo's work the dawn of a new era of understanding. The publication of Sidereus Nuncius cemented Galileo's reputation as a leading natural philosopher and astronomer. It was a bold declaration of a new way of seeing the universe, not through ancient texts and philosophical arguments, but through the direct evidence provided by a revolutionary instrument. It fundamentally shifted the intellectual landscape, forcing a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the cosmos, and setting the stage for further scientific inquiry and, eventually, profound challenges to established authority. The widespread acclaim generated by Sidereus Nuncius did not go unnoticed by the powerful Medici family in Florence. For years, Galileo had cultivated connections with this influential dynasty, dedicating his geometric compass to the young Cosimo II of Medici in 1606 and more recently, naming Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars in their honour. These gestures, combined with his burgeoning international fame, bore fruit. In 1610, an offer arrived that Galileo found impossible to refuse. Cosimo II de' Medici, now the Grand Duke of Tuscany, invited Galileo to return to Florence. The proposed position was that of chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke, a prestigious and highly sought-after role. This was not a university post with its attendant teaching obligations and often modest salary. Instead, it was a court appointment, offering a substantial income and, crucially, liberation from the demanding duties of lecturing and student instruction. For Galileo, this represented a profound change. His years at the University of Padua, though incredibly productive, had been marked by the continuous need to earn a living through teaching and the fabrication of instruments. The Florentine offer promised intellectual freedom and the leisure to dedicate himself entirely to research, observation, and writing. He would be free to pursue his astronomical and physical investigations without the daily interruptions of academic life. This move back to his native Tuscany was not merely a geographical shift. It symbolized a transition in Galileo's professional life. He was moving from the relative intellectual freedom, but also the practical demands, of the Venetian Republic to the more courtly, aristocratic environment of Florence. Here, he would be a respected scholar in residence, directly supported by one of Europe's most prominent ruling families. The new role allowed him to focus solely on the pursuit of knowledge, to refine his theories, and to further unravel the secrets of the cosmos, all under the patronage of the powerful Medici. It was a position that promised both comfort and unparalleled opportunity for scientific endeavour. The revelations contained within Sidereus Nuncius, and indeed all of Galileo's telescopic observations, elicited a varied response across Europe. For many, particularly among the educated public and some progressive scholars, the discoveries were met with astonishment and admiration. The idea of a universe far more complex and dynamic than previously imagined captivated the intellectual imagination. Galileo's work quickly became a topic of fervent discussion in academies, courts, and universities. Copies of his treatises were eagerly sought, and the implications of his findings were debated across a broad spectrum of society. Yet, this initial acclaim was not universal. A significant portion of the academic establishment, deeply entrenched in Aristotelian cosmology and scholastic philosophy, found Galileo's claims unsettling, even heretical. Their worldview rested upon centuries of accepted doctrine, which posited a perfect, unchanging celestial realm and a stationary Earth at the centre of the universe. The telescopic observations directly challenged these foundational tenets, and to admit the truth of Galileo's findings would necessitate a fundamental re-evaluation of their entire intellectual framework. Skepticism, therefore, was a common reaction. Some scholars simply dismissed the telescopic phenomena as optical illusions or defects of Galileo's instrument. Others argued that the new celestial bodies, such as Jupiter's moons, were not real, but rather reflections within the telescope's lenses, or perhaps even a trick of light. Perhaps most illustrative of this resistance was the outright refusal of some prominent figures to even look through the telescope themselves. They believed that what could not be perceived by the naked eye, and what contradicted established wisdom, simply could not exist. To peer into the eyepiece and witness these phenomena firsthand would be to risk confronting an uncomfortable truth. A notable example was Cesare Cremonini, a respected philosophy professor at the University of Padua, who steadfastly declined Galileo's invitations to observe the heavens through the instrument. Similarly, Francesco Sisi, a Florentine scholar, argued that because there were only 7 planets, including the sun and moon in the traditional sense, and 7 openings in the human head, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and 1 mouth, there could not possibly be more than 7 planets in the cosmos. Such arguments, while appearing illogical from a modern perspective, reflected a deep commitment to an established order of knowledge. Thus, alongside the wonder, a powerful current of denial and intellectual resistance began to form around Galileo's revolutionary insights. The implications of his observations were simply too profound for many to accept without a struggle. As Galileo's telescopic observations gained wider currency, and as the heliocentric theory began to be discussed with greater frequency and seriousness, a subtle but significant shift in perspective started to occur within the Catholic Church. Initially, many high-ranking church officials, including some cardinals, expressed genuine interest and even admiration for Galileo's scientific achievements. The Church had historically supported scholarly inquiry, and scientific advancement in principle was not viewed as inherently antagonistic to faith. However, the core tenets of the Copernican system, particularly the notion of a moving Earth orbiting the Sun, gradually began to raise serious theological concerns. The geocentric model, with Earth at the unmoving centre of the universe, was not merely an astronomical theory. It was deeply interwoven with prevailing interpretations of sacred scripture. Several passages in the Bible, when read literally, appear to support a stationary Earth and a moving sun. For instance, the 10th chapter of the book of Joshua describes the prophet commanding the sun and moon to stand still. Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon, in the valley of Ajalon. If the sun were already stationary and the earth moved, the command of the sun to stand still would seem nonsensical. Similarly, passages in Ecclesiastes and Psalms spoke of the earth being established forever and not to be moved, which was interpreted as unequivocal support for its immobility. These scriptural interpretations were not minor points of debate, although they formed part of a long-standing theological tradition. The Church, as the guardian of divine revelation, felt a profound responsibility to protect what it understood to be the truth of Scripture. To accept a heliocentric universe, therefore, would necessitate either a radical reinterpretation of these biblical passages, or an admission that Scripture, when read literally, could be in error regarding matters of the physical world. Both prospects were deeply troubling to many within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The issue was not simply about scientific accuracy, it was about authority and the proper understanding of God's Word. For centuries, the literal interpretation of these passages had been the accepted view, reinforced by Aristotelian physics. Now a new astronomical model, based on empirical observation, he seemed to challenge this established harmony between scripture and natural philosophy. This growing tension marked the beginning of a complex and ultimately tragic conflict between scientific inquiry and theological doctrine. Amidst the rising theological unease regarding the implications of heliocentrism, Galileo found himself increasingly drawn into discussions about the relationship between scientific discovery and scriptural interpretation. These conversations were often informal, taking place among scholars and clergy. In December of 1613, a particularly significant exchange occurred during a breakfast at the Medici court in Pisa. Benedetto Castelli, one of Galileo's former students and now a professor of mathematics, where he found himself defending Galileo's views against the literal scriptural arguments put forth by other courtiers and a duchess. Following this discussion, Castelli wrote to Galileo, recounting the debate and seeking his guidance. Galileo's detailed response, penned shortly thereafter, became known as the Letter to Castelli. This document stands as a crucial articulation of Galileo's thoughts on the proper way to reconcile scientific observation with religious texts. In this letter, Galileo carefully articulated his position, emphasizing that the Bible, while divinely inspired, was written in a language accessible to the common person of its time. Its primary purpose, he argued, was to guide humanity toward salvation and moral righteousness, not to provide literal scientific descriptions of the physical universe. He proposed that when scientific observation and rigorous demonstration clearly established a truth about the natural world, and this truth appeared to contradict a literal reading of Scripture, then it was the scriptural interpretation that needed to be re-examined, not the scientific finding dismissed. Galileo suggested that God had provided humanity with two distinct books of knowledge, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. Both were divine revelations, but they spoke in different languages and served different purposes. The book of nature, he contended, was written in the language of mathematics and geometry, and could only be truly understood through observation, experiment, and logical deduction. To interpret the Bible literally in matters of science, he argued, and could lead to absurd conclusions and potentially undermine the credibility of faith itself, if those literal interpretations were demonstrably false through natural evidence. He famously stated in a later, expanded version of this argument, but in essence conveyed in the Letter to Castelli, that the Holy Spirit's intention was to teach us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. This elegant phrase encapsulated his argument that theological texts were focused on spiritual truth, while natural philosophy was concerned with empirical truth. He believed these two domains, when properly understood, could not truly contradict each other, as both ultimately derived from God. The letter, however, began to circulate, drawing the attention of those who saw its arguments as a direct challenge to the Church's interpretative authority. The circulation of Galileo's Letter to Castelli, and later an expanded version known as the Letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, intensified the scrutiny of his views within the Church. The arguments he put forth suggesting that Scripture could be reinterpreted in light of scientific evidence were seen by some as an encroachment upon the exclusive authority of the Church to interpret sacred texts. The theological climate in Rome was becoming increasingly conservative, particularly in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, where challenges to Catholic doctrine were met with firm resistance. As the heliocentric theory gained more proponents, and Galileo continued to champion it, the Holy Office of the Inquisition began a formal investigation. The matter was not merely about scientific theory. It had become intertwined with questions of faith, authority, and the very stability of Catholic doctrine. In February of 1616, a panel of theologians, known as qualifiers, were tasked with evaluating two key propositions stemming from Copernicanism. Their findings were unequivocal and severe. On February 24, 1616, the qualifiers issued their judgment. The proposition that the sun is the centre of the world and immovable in place was declared to be foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical inasmuch as it expressly contradicts the doctrine of Holy Scripture in many places, according to the proper sense of the words and the common interpretation and understanding of the Holy Fathers and Doctors of theology. The second proposition, that the earth is not the centre of the world nor immovable, but moves as a whole, and also with a diurnal motion, was likewise deemed to receive the same censure in philosophy, and as regards theological truth, to be at least erroneous in faith. Following this decisive condemnation, on March 5, 1616, the Congregation of the Index issued a decree. This decree formally suspended Nicholas Copernicus's seminal work De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres until it could be corrected. The corrections required involved altering passages that presented heliocentrism as an established fact, rather than a mere hypothesis. Additionally, other books advocating the Copernican doctrine were also placed on the index of prohibited books, effectively banning them from Catholic readership. For Galileo, this marked a significant turning point, a clear and public declaration from the highest ecclesiastical authority against the astronomical system he so passionately defended. In the wake of the formal condemnation of Copernicanism, a crucial meeting took place, involving Galileo Galilei and Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. Cardinal Bellarmine was a highly respected theologian and a powerful figure within the Roman Curia, known for his judiciousness and intellectual rigour. He had previously engaged with Galileo in correspondence, expressing his caution regarding the heliocentric theory and the need for irrefutable proof before it could be accepted as truth, especially given its apparent conflict with Scripture. On February 26, 1616, just days after the theological qualifiers had rendered their judgment, Galileo was summoned to Bellarmine's residence. The purpose of this encounter was not to condemn Galileo personally, but to convey the Church's official position and to impress upon him the seriousness of the situation. Bellarmine, acting on behalf of the Holy Office, formally admonished Galileo. He instructed him to abandon his belief in the Copernican doctrine. The Cardinal's directive was clear. Galileo was not to hold or defend the heliocentric theory as a physical reality. He was permitted to discuss it as a mathematical hypothesis, a tool for calculation that could simplify astronomical predictions, but not as an accurate description of the cosmos. This distinction between hypothesis and physical truth was crucial in the eyes of the Church. As long as heliocentrism remained a mere theoretical construct, it posed no direct threat to biblical interpretation. It is important to note that at this stage Galileo was not subjected to formal trial, nor was he imprisoned or excommunicated. The admonition from Cardinal Bellarmine constituted a warning, a directive to conform his public and private expressions on the matter to the Church's declared stance. A document known as the Bellarmine Certificate, later issued to Galileo, confirmed that he had not been condemned for heresy. It stated that he had merely been informed of the declaration made by the Pope and the Congregation of the Index which forbade the teaching or defending of the Copernican doctrine. This encounter with Cardinal Bellarmine was a pivotal moment in Galileo's life. It established a boundary, a clear line beyond which his scientific inquiries and public pronouncements on the nature of the universe were not to cross. He was now acutely aware of the theological implications of his work and the watchful eye of the Inquisition. For a time, Galileo respected this admonition, choosing to pursue other areas of scientific investigation that did not directly challenge the geocentric orthodoxy. Following the admonition from Cardinal Bellarmine in 1616, Galileo entered a period characterized by a notable shift in his public approach to the Copernican theory. The unequivocal directive from the Holy Office conveyed by such a prominent figure served as a potent reminder of the theological boundaries that had been established. For several years thereafter, Galileo maintained a relative silence on the sensitive topic of heliocentrism as a physical reality. This was not a period of inactivity for Galileo, but rather one of strategic caution. He continued his profound scientific investigations, dedicating his intellect to various fields of study. His work during this time included delving deeper into the nature of sunspots, a phenomenon he had observed with his telescope, and exploring the properties of floating bodies, which led to a detailed treatise. He also engaged in practical matters, such as improving methods for determining longitude at sea, a problem of great practical importance. However, when it came to the grand cosmological debate, Galileo exercised considerable prudence. He avoided publicly asserting the physical truth of the Earth's motion around the Sun. His earlier passionate defences and his challenges to scriptural interpretation were largely set aside. He understood that further open advocacy of heliocentrism, beyond its hypothetical utility, could lead to far more severe consequences than the warning he'd received. The intellectual landscape in Italy remained charged with theological vigilance. The works of Copernicus and those that supported his ideas were still on the index of prohibited books. Therefore, any scholar discussing these topics had to navigate a complex terrain, carefully distinguishing between mathematical models and statements about the universe's actual structure. Galileo, with his keen understanding of political and religious sensitivities, largely adhered to this prescribed caution. His correspondence from these years occasionally touched upon astronomical matters, but often with a circumspection that was absent from his earlier, more assertive writings. He continued to observe the heavens, refining his understanding of planetary motions, but the public expression of his insights was tempered by the memory of the 1616 admonition. This period of relative silence on Copernicanism allowed Galileo to continue his scientific endeavours within the bounds set by the Church, waiting for a more opportune moment, or perhaps a shift in the prevailing intellectual climate, before once again engaging with the most contentious aspect of his astronomical work. The year 1618 brought a new celestial spectacle that would draw Galileo back into public scientific discourse, albeit indirectly at first. 3 prominent comets appeared in the night sky, captivating observers across Europe. These transient visitors sparked widespread interest and renewed debate about the nature of the cosmos, particularly among astronomers and natural philosophers. One of the most significant contributions to this discussion came from the Jesuit astronomer Orazio Grassi. He published a treatise on the comets, arguing that they were real celestial bodies, travelling through the heavens beyond the moon. This view was largely consistent with a more progressive understanding of the cosmos, moving away from the ancient Aristotelian idea that comets were merely atmospheric phenomena. Grassi's work, De Tribus Cometis Anni 1618, positioned him as a leading voice in the astronomical community. Galileo, still adhering to the caution imposed by the 1616 admonition regarding Copernicanism, did not immediately publish his own views on the comets. However, he was keenly interested in the phenomenon and had his own distinct perspective. Through his student Mario Guiducci, giver who delivered a lecture at the Florentine Academy, Galileo's ideas were publicly presented. Guiducci's discourse, almost certainly penned or heavily influenced by Galileo, posited a very different explanation for the comets. Instead of being distant celestial bodies, Galileo, through Guiducci, argued that comets were optical illusions, or at least atmospheric phenomena. He suggested they were merely reflections or exhalations within the Earth's atmosphere, closer to the Earth than the Moon. This position, while seemingly regressive in light of earlier telescopic discoveries, was rooted in Galileo's specific physical arguments and his reluctance to assign definite celestial orbits to bodies whose parallax could not be reliably measured. This indirect challenge to Grassi's views ignited a new intellectual skirmish. The debate over the nature and location of comets, while seemingly separate from the heliocentric controversy, touched upon fundamental questions of celestial mechanics and the methods of scientific inquiry. It set the stage for a more direct engagement between Galileo and the Jesuit astronomers, further complicating his relationship with powerful figures within the Church. The debate over the comets of 1618, particularly with the Jesuit Orazio Grassi, provided Galileo with an opportunity to articulate his scientific philosophy with unparalleled clarity and force. This came to fruition in his remarkable work, Il Saggiatore, or The Assayer, published in 1623. Though ostensibly a response to Grassi's earlier treatise, it transcended the specific topic of comets to become a profound manifesto for the emerging scientific method. In The Assayer, Galileo did not merely refute Grassi's astronomical arguments point by point. He laid bare a fundamental difference in their approaches to understanding the natural world. Grassi, in Galileo's view, relied too heavily on authority in established scholastic traditions. Galileo, by contrast, championed empirical observation, mathematical reasoning, and logical deduction as the true paths to knowledge. The most enduring and celebrated passage from the Assayer is where Galileo famously declared that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. He elaborated that this book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering about in a dark labyrinth. This assertion was revolutionary. It elevated mathematics from a mere tool for description to the essential grammar of the universe itself. For Galileo, true understanding of physical phenomena was impossible without expressing them in quantitative terms. This statement underscored his belief that the universe operated according to immutable, discoverable laws that could be deciphered through careful measurement and mathematical analysis, rather than through philosophical speculation or reliance on ancient texts alone. The Assayer thus became a foundational text in the history of science, not only for its specific arguments, but for its powerful articulation of a new way of knowing. It emphasized that true knowledge of nature comes from diligent observation, rigorous experimentation, and the application of mathematical principles, thereby establishing a bedrock for modern empirical science. The year 1623 brought with it a significant shift in the political and ecclesiastical landscape of Rome, one that filled Galileo with a renewed sense of optimism regarding his life's work. In that year, Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a long-standing friend and ardent admirer of Galileo, was elected to the papacy, taking the name Urban VIII. Barberini was not merely an acquaintance. He was a man of considerable intellect and artistic sensibility, deeply engaged with the intellectual currents of his time. Yet he had corresponded with Galileo for many years, expressing admiration for his scientific discoveries and even composing a poem in his honour. This personal connection, coupled with Barberini's reputation as a patron of arts and sciences, offered Galileo a glimmer of hope that the rigid stance the Church had adopted towards Copernicanism might finally begin to soften. The previous admonition of 1616, which had prohibited Galileo from holding or defending the Copernican theory as physically true, had cast a long shadow over his scientific endeavours, while the Assayer had allowed him to articulate his methodological principles. The core cosmological question remained officially closed. With Urban VIII on the papal throne, Galileo believed that a more nuanced understanding might prevail. He saw in Urban VIII a pontiff who, unlike some of his predecessors, possessed a genuine appreciation for scientific inquiry and a more flexible theological outlook. This change at the very top of the church hierarchy seemed to open a new chapter for Galileo. He interpreted Urban VIII's election as an invitation to re-engage with the debate surrounding the structure of the cosmos, perhaps even to present arguments for Copernicanism in a way that would be acceptable to the new pope. This was not a naive hope. Galileo had received numerous assurances of friendship and support from Barberini over the years. The atmosphere in Rome, at least from Galileo's perspective, felt more conducive to open intellectual discussion than it had in a long time. The election of Urban VIII thus marked a pivotal moment, and a turning point where Galileo perceived a genuine opportunity to advance his scientific convictions within the framework of the Church. Encouraged by the more receptive atmosphere under Pope Urban VIII, Galileo embarked on his most ambitious and ultimately most controversial work, the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. This book, published in 1632, was designed to be a comprehensive discussion of the Ptolemaic, geocentric, and Copernican, heliocentric models of the universe. Galileo chose a dialogue format, presenting the arguments through the voices of three distinct characters. This approach allowed him to explore the complexities of the astronomical theories without explicitly endorsing one over the other, at least on the surface. The main participants in this intellectual exchange were Salviati, who largely represented Galileo's own views and the Copernican perspective, Simplicio, an Aristotelian philosopher who defended the traditional geocentric worldview, and Sagredo, an intelligent, open-minded Venetian nobleman who acted as an impartial arbiter, often asking clarifying questions and synthesizing the arguments. The structure of the dialogue was carefully crafted over 4 days of imagined conversation. Each day was dedicated to a different aspect of the cosmological debate, moving from general arguments about the structure of the heavens to more specific discussions of planetary motion, tides, and the observed phenomena that supported or refuted each system. Galileo meticulously presented the scientific evidence and mathematical reasoning that underpinned the Copernican model, contrasting it with the perceived weaknesses and inconsistencies of the Ptolemaic system. While the preface stated an intention to present both sides fairly and without judgment, and even included a formal disclaimer that the work was merely a mathematical hypothesis, the narrative flow and the rhetorical power of Salviati's arguments subtly but clearly favoured the Copernican view. Simplicio, the defender of the old order, often appeared less persuasive and at times even somewhat obtuse in his reasoning, particularly when confronted with empirical observations. This seemingly balanced presentation, however, would soon become a point of contention, as the perception of neutrality was not universally shared. The character of Simplicio in Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems was intended to represent the staunch Aristotelian philosopher, a traditionalist who adhered strictly to established doctrines. However, this portrayal became a critical point of contention, leading to unforeseen and severe consequences for Galileo. Simplicio was depicted as often stubborn, clinging to classical authorities even when faced with compelling empirical evidence or mathematical arguments. He frequently resorted to quoting ancient texts and philosophical principles, rather than engaging with the new observations and logical deductions presented by Salviati. While Galileo likely intended Simplicio to embody the broader resistance to scientific innovation, a more damaging interpretation began to circulate. Unwisely, some readers, and crucially, while Pope Urban VIII himself began to perceive Simplicio's arguments as mirroring the Pope's own views on certain matters. Urban VIII had, in conversations with Galileo, presented a particular theological argument regarding God's omnipotence, that God could have created the universe in any manner he chose, and therefore it was presumptuous for humans to definitively assert the true structure of the cosmos based solely on human reason. This argument, asserting that human intellect could not fully comprehend God's infinite power and choices, was indeed placed into the mouth of Simplicio at the very end of the dialogue. For Pope Urban VIII, this was not merely an academic slight. He felt deeply insulted and betrayed. He had previously granted Galileo permission to publish the dialogue, provided it presented both sides fairly and concluded with the assertion of God's omnipotence as a safeguard against dogmatic claims of human certainty. To see his own carefully articulated theological argument placed in the mouth of the character who was consistently portrayed as simple-minded, resistant to new ideas, and ultimately outmaneuvered by the Copernican advocate, felt like a deliberate mockery. The Pope interpreted this as a personal affront, a public humiliation orchestrated by a man he had once considered a friend and intellectual peer. This perceived betrayal transformed Urban VIII's earlier support and protection into a powerful sense of indignation, setting the stage for a dramatic and tragic shift in Galileo's fortunes. The character intended to represent philosophical conservatism instead became, in the eyes of the most powerful man in the Catholic Church, a thinly veiled caricature of himself, thereby sealing Galileo's fate. The publication of the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems and the ensuing papal indignation soon led to dire consequences for Galileo. By August of 1632, the distribution of the book was abruptly halted, and a special commission was established by Pope Urban VIII to examine the work. The findings of this commission were swift and unfavourable, concluding that Galileo had indeed violated the 1616 injunction. As autumn deepened, the inevitable summons arrived. In September 1632, Galileo received a formal order from the Holy Office of the Inquisition to present himself in Rome. This was a grave moment, a summons that carried the weight of ecclesiastical authority and the ominous prospect of a trial. To be called before the Inquisition was to face one of the most powerful and feared institutions of the era, an organization designed to root out heresy and enforce doctrinal purity. For Galileo, who was by then 68 years old, the journey itself presented a significant hardship. He was no longer the robust man of his youth, having endured years of chronic illness, including severe arthritis and a painful hernia. The prospect of a long, arduous trip from Florence to Rome, especially during the colder months, was daunting. His health was fragile, and the emotional burden of the summons weighed heavily upon him. He attempted to defer his appearance, citing his advanced age and infirmities, hoping to persuade the authorities to allow him to present his defence from Florence, or at least delay the proceedings until spring. However, these appeals were met with unyielding demands from Rome. The Pope, still deeply offended by the perceived mockery in the dialogue, insisted on Galileo's personal presence. The message was clear: no excuses would be accepted, and failure to comply would result in forcible transport to Rome, an even more humiliating and physically taxing ordeal. Thus, in the chill of winter, Galileo began to prepare for a journey that he knew could irrevocably alter the course of his remaining life. The summons to Rome in 1632 marked the beginning of the most challenging and tragic chapter of his scientific career, forcing him to confront the full might of the Church's authority. Galileo arrived in Rome in February of 1633, a journey that further depleted his already fragile health. He was initially lodged at the Tuscan embassy, a gesture of respect owed to his prominence and age. However, this period of relative comfort was brief. By April, the formal interrogations commenced. These were not public proceedings, but rather a series of intense private interviews conducted by the inquisitors. The core of the prosecution's case revolved around the 1616 injunction, which had specifically forbidden Galileo from holding or defending the Copernican doctrine. The dialogue was presented as clear evidence of his transgression. During the interrogations, Galileo maintained that he had not defended Copernicanism as a physical truth, but merely discussed it as a mathematical hypothesis, as he believed he was permitted to do. He argued that his intention in the dialogue was to present arguments for both sides, as demonstrated by the structure of the book itself. However, the inquisitors pressed him relentlessly. They pointed to specific passages in the dialogue where the arguments for heliocentrism were presented with such force and eloquence that they appeared to champion the theory, while the arguments for geocentrism seemed weaker, even ridiculed through the character of Simplicio. The legal complexities of the case were immense, as Galileo found himself in a position where the interpretation of his own words was being dictated by his accusers. The pressure on Galileo was immense, both psychological and emotional. He was an elderly man, suffering physically, facing the full might of the Holy Office. The threat of torture, though rarely applied to individuals of his stature, was an underlying possibility in any Inquisition trial, and the veiled suggestion of its use was part of the coercive atmosphere. He was confronted with documents, including the crucial minute from 1616 that recorded the admonition, though its exact wording and legal weight became points of contention. His responses during these interrogations were carefully measured, attempting to navigate the precarious line between intellectual honesty and self-preservation. He tried to explain his intentions, to clarify the nuances of his scientific approach, and to demonstrate his obedience to the Church's authority. Yet the inquisitors were not seeking a nuanced scientific debate. They were seeking an admission of guilt, a recantation of the views deemed heretical. The stage was set for a profound confrontation between scientific conviction and ecclesiastical power. The culmination of the trial, and the most poignant moment of Galileo's confrontation with the Inquisition, were arrived on June 22, 1633. On this day, in the solemn chambers of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, Galileo Galilei was brought before the tribunal. Dressed in the white penitential shirt, he knelt, a figure of profound humility and submission. Surrounded by the cardinals and officials of the Holy Office, Galileo was compelled to read aloud his abjuration. This was not a voluntary statement, but a carefully crafted declaration prepared by the Inquisition itself. In a voice that must have been laden with the weight of consequence, he pronounced his retraction of the Copernican doctrine. He declared that he abjured, cursed, and detested the error and heresy of holding that the sun is the centre of the world and immovable, and that the earth moves. He affirmed that he would never again say or assert, orally or in writing, anything that might give rise to similar suspicion. The act of abjuration was a public spectacle of submission, designed to reinforce the authority of the Church and to deter others from challenging its pronouncements. For Galileo, it represented a profound personal humiliation. To recant a truth he had observed, measured, and mathematically demonstrated under duress was an immense sacrifice of intellectual integrity. He was forced to deny what his own eyes, aided by the telescope, had shown him, and what his reason had confirmed. While the exact words he uttered, beyond the prescribed text, are not definitively recorded, the scene itself spoke volumes. It was a moment where the pursuit of empirical truth clashed directly with dogmatic authority, and where, for a time, authority prevailed. The abjuration was not merely a legal formality. It was a deeply symbolic act that reverberated through the history of science and the relationship between faith and reason. With this painful retraction, Galileo's public advocacy for heliocentrism was brought to a definitive, enforced end. Following the solemn act of abjuration, the Inquisition pronounced Galileo's sentence. It was a judgment that would define the remainder of his days, perpetual house arrest. Initially, there was a brief period of confinement within the palace of the Archbishop of Siena, a temporary reprieve from the harsher conditions of a prison cell. However, this was soon replaced by the more permanent arrangement that would last for the rest of his life. Galileo was permitted to return to his villa in Arcetri, a quiet residence situated on a hillside just outside Florence. It was here, in the familiar surroundings of his home, that his long confinement began. Though not a prison in the traditional sense, the villa became his personal jail. He was forbidden from leaving the property without explicit permission from the Holy Office, a permission that was rarely granted and always conditional. All visitors were subject to approval, and communication with the outside world was closely monitored. The isolation was profound. The bustling intellectual life of Rome, the lively debates of the academies, and the freedom to travel and converse with fellow scholars were now distant memories. The scenic views of the Tuscan landscape, while beautiful, served as a constant reminder of the world from which he was now largely cut off. The sounds of daily life, the rustling leaves, the distant church bells underscored his limited existence. This loss of freedom was a heavy burden for a man whose life had been dedicated to exploration and discovery. His scientific instruments, his books, and his thoughts became his primary companions. The vibrant mind that had once soared through the heavens charting new worlds was now tethered to a fixed point on Earth, under constant surveillance. The house in Arcetri, once a place of comfort and intellectual pursuit, transformed into a gilded cage, a symbol of the Church's unwavering control over a brilliant yet now silenced voice. His days would unfold within these walls, under the ever-present shadow of his sentence. In the profound solitude of his house arrest, a significant source of solace for Galileo came from his eldest daughter, Virginia. She had entered the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri at a young age, adopting the name Sister Maria Celeste. Her proximity, a mere short distance from his villa, allowed for a unique connection during his confinement. Sister Maria Celeste was a constant presence in Galileo's emotional landscape, offering a profound sense of comfort and unwavering support through her regular correspondence. Her letters were a gentle balm, filled with expressions of affection, practical concerns, and spiritual encouragement. She often sent him homemade remedies for his various ailments, prepared small treats, and managed aspects of his household, all while navigating the strictures of her monastic life. Her devotion was evident in every communication. She understood the depth of his suffering, the intellectual frustrations, and the personal humiliation he endured. Through her words she sought to lighten his burden, reminding him of her prayers and her steadfast love. These letters were not merely familial exchanges, they were lifelines, anchoring Galileo in a world that had become increasingly hostile and isolating. Maria Celeste's unwavering spirit and practical kindness offered a poignant contrast to the harsh realities of his situation. Her faith, deeply held, provided her with a perspective that transcended earthly tribulations, and she sought to impart a measure of that peace to her father. The warmth and empathy contained within her messages provided a vital human connection, a reminder of unconditional affection amidst the chill of official censure. Her presence, even if often felt through written words, was a beacon of light in the dimness of his enforced solitude, adding a tender human dimension to his otherwise austere existence. Despite the profound constraints of his house arrest and the steady decline of his physical health, Galileo's intellectual fire remained undimmed. The final years of his life, though marked by isolation and increasing blindness, were surprisingly productive, culminating in a work that would prove to be one of his most enduring contributions to science. This monumental treatise, published in 1638, was titled Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations relating to two new sciences pertaining to mechanics and local motions, often simply referred to as two new sciences. This work was a culmination of decades of research, much of it conducted during his earlier, more active years at Padua, but meticulously refined and expanded during his confinement. Unable to publish it in Catholic Italy, the manuscript was smuggled out of the country and eventually printed in Leiden, in the Protestant Netherlands, a testament to the international reach of scientific inquiry, even in an age of strict censorship. Two new sciences shifted Galileo's focus away from the controversial astronomical theories that had led to his downfall and towards fundamental principles of physics. It was structured as a dialogue, much like his earlier ill-fated dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. But this time the discussions revolved around terrestrial mechanics rather than celestial motions. The characters, Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio, engaged in thoughtful exchanges, exploring the properties of materials and the laws of motion. The first new science addressed the strength of materials. Galileo meticulously investigated how structures, such as beams and columns, resist breaking. He delved into concepts like tensile strength and the scaling laws that dictate why larger structures cannot simply be scaled up proportionally from smaller ones without compromising their integrity. This foundational work laid the groundwork for engineering mechanics. The second new science focused on local motions, particularly the motion of falling bodies and projectiles. Building upon his earlier experiments, Galileo presented a rigorous mathematical analysis of acceleration, demonstrating that objects fall with a constant acceleration regardless of their mass in a vacuum. He also explored projectile motion, showing that the path of a projectile is parabolic, a revolutionary insight that combined geometry with observation. This systematic approach to motion, relying on experiment and mathematical description, fundamentally transformed the study of dynamics and became a cornerstone of classical physics. As Galileo entered the final phase of his life, a new and profound challenge began to manifest itself: the gradual dimming of his vision. This affliction, which had likely been developing for some time, became increasingly severe, casting a literal shadow over the man who had brought the distant cosmos into sharp focus for humanity. By 1637, just a year before the publication of his monumental Two New Sciences, Galileo's eyesight had deteriorated to a critical degree. He struggled to read, to write, and to observe the world around him, tasks that had defined his very existence. The once vivid celestial tapestry he had explored with his telescope, revealing moons around Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the rugged surface of the moon, slowly faded into an indistinct blur. The specific cause of his blindness remains a subject of historical speculation, but it was likely a combination of cataracts and glaucoma, conditions exacerbated by the intense scrutiny he had often subjected his eyes to, both through his early telescopic observations of the sun and the demanding work of his later years. The irony was poignant. The man who had gifted humanity a new way of seeing the universe was slowly losing his own ability to perceive it. By 1638, the year Two New Sciences finally saw print, Galileo was almost entirely blind in his right eye. Within another year, the darkness had enveloped his left eye as well, plunging him into complete and irreversible blindness. This physical incapacitation was a cruel twist of fate for a man whose life had been dedicated to empirical observation and visual discovery. The vibrant world of light and shadow, of mathematical diagrams and handwritten notes, was replaced by a perpetual twilight. Despite this profound sensory loss, Galileo's spirit of inquiry did not entirely extinguish. He continued to think, to dictate, and to engage with visitors, relying on the eyes and hands of his assistants and students to transcribe his thoughts and read to him from books. Yet, the inability to directly perceive the world, to look through a lens, or to sketch a diagram, marked a tragic and deeply personal end to his visual exploration of the cosmos. The universe, which he had so eloquently described, thus now existed for him primarily in the realm of memory and abstract thought. Even as the world outside grew dim, the internal light of Galileo's intellect continued to burn, perhaps even more brightly. His blindness, though a profound personal tragedy, did not extinguish his insatiable curiosity or his dedication to scientific inquiry. Confined to his villa and stripped of his sight, he redirected his energies, relying on a small circle of loyal students and assistants to act as his eyes and hands. These final years were characterized by a quiet, persistent intellectual activity. Galileo would dictate his thoughts, observations, and ongoing scientific problems, and his assistants, such as Vincenzo Viviani and Evangelista Torricelli, would meticulously transcribe them. This method, though slower and more laborious than direct engagement with paper and pen, allowed him to continue exploring mathematical and physical concepts. He pondered questions of impact, the properties of materials, and the nature of motion, building upon the foundations laid in two new sciences. His mind remained remarkably sharp, capable of intricate thought experiments and complex calculations, even without the aid of visual notation. He engaged in discussions, posed challenging problems to his young protégé, and continued to refine his understanding of the physical world. These exchanges were not merely academic exercises. They were a testament to a spirit that refused to be confined by physical limitations or external pressures. Galileo's house in Arcetri became a quiet hub of scientific thought, a place where the blind master, though isolated from the wider intellectual community, continued to shape the minds of the next generation. He was more than a teacher. He was a living embodiment of the scientific method, a persistent seeker of truth, who, even in his infirmity, demonstrated an unwavering commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. His final intellectual endeavours, though less widely known than his earlier astronomical discoveries, reinforced his legacy as a tireless investigator, a man whose dedication to understanding the universe transcended even the loss of his most vital sense for observation. As the year 1641 drew to a close, Galileo's health, which had been steadily declining for years, began to fail more rapidly. The arduous interrogations, the subsequent house arrest, and the relentless march of age had taken their toll. His blindness, coupled with a growing list of ailments, including severe arthritis and insomnia, left him increasingly frail. Yet, his mind remained keen, continuing to engage with scientific problems and dictating his thoughts to those around him. The winter months brought a deepening chill to the Tuscan hills, and with it a further weakening of the great scientist's constitution. Surrounded by the familiar confines of his Arcetri villa, the same place that had served as both his prison and his final sanctuary of thought, Galileo approached his end. His devoted students, including Viviani and Torricelli, remained at his side, offering comfort and tending to his needs. They were not merely caregivers, they were the inheritors of his intellectual legacy, witnessing the quiet passing of a man who had profoundly reshaped human understanding. On January 8th, 1642, in the quiet solitude of his home, Galileo Galilei breathed his last. He was 77 years old. His death, in stark contrast to the controversies and public spectacles that had marked much of his later life, was a private affair. There were no grand pronouncements from the church, no public mourning on a national scale. He passed away under the shadow of the same house arrest that had confined him for nearly a decade, a decree that remained in effect until his very last breath. the world lost a towering intellect, a figure whose courage and curiosity had ignited a revolution in scientific thought. His life had been a testament to the power of observation and reason, a relentless quest to understand the universe through empirical evidence. Though his final years were marked by hardship and isolation, his influence had already spread far beyond the walls of Arcetri, quietly seeding the ground for the scientific advancements that would follow. His passing marked the end of a remarkable journey, a life lived on the frontiers of knowledge, forever altering humanity's perception of its place in the cosmos. The immediate aftermath of Galileo's death on that cold January morning in 1642 revealed the lingering shadow of his condemnation. Despite his immense contributions to knowledge and the quiet dignity of his passing, the official stance of the Church remained firm. The decree of the Inquisition, which had placed him under house arrest, continued to dictate his fate even in death. Cardinal Francesco Barberini, the nephew of Pope Urban VIII, and Mock initially expressed a wish for Galileo to be interred in the family tomb within the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, a place of honour reserved for Italy's most distinguished figures. However, this proposal was met with swift and unequivocal opposition from the ecclesiastical authorities. The Pope himself, Urban VIII, intervened directly, forbidding any such public recognition. The reasoning behind this refusal was clear. Galileo had died a condemned man in the eyes of the Church, having been found vehemently suspect of heresy for his adherence to the Copernican theory. To grant him a prominent burial in consecrated ground, complete with a grand monument, would have been perceived as an endorsement of his ideas, or at the very least a softening of the Church's position. Such an act would have publicly contradicted the very judgments of the Inquisition. Consequently, the plans for a stately burial were abandoned. Instead, Galileo's remains were interred in a far more modest fashion. He was laid to rest in a small, obscure chamber within the Basilica of Santa Croce itself, but not in the main body of the church. This chamber was located in the Chapel of Novices, a less prominent area, indicating a deliberate effort to minimize any public display of reverence. There was no grand tomb, no elaborate epitaph, no public ceremony to mark the passing of a man who had reshaped the scientific landscape. The quiet, almost clandestine nature of his burial underscored the Church's continued disapproval. It was a stark reminder that even in death the long arm of the Inquisition could still exert its power, denying public honour to a man whose scientific truths had clashed so dramatically with established dogma. For many years his final resting place remained understated, a silent testament to the enduring tensions between scientific inquiry and religious authority. The quiet, almost unacknowledged burial of Galileo in 1642 was not to be his final resting place. Nearly a century passed, a period during which scientific understanding continued to advance, and the intellectual landscape of Europe gradually shifted. The truths Galileo had championed, initially met with such fierce resistance, slowly gained wider acceptance within scholarly circles. As the decades unfolded, the scientific community increasingly recognized the profound significance of Galileo's work. His contributions to physics, astronomy, and the scientific method became foundational elements of modern inquiry. The world moved forward, and with it, perspectives on the relationship between faith and reason began to evolve, albeit slowly. By the early 18th century, the cultural and intellectual climate in Florence had changed considerably. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, where Galileo had spent much of his life, sought to honour its most illustrious son. There was a growing desire to rectify the historical injustice of his modest burial, and to accord him the recognition he deserved as one of Italy's greatest minds. This shift culminated in 1737, when a concerted effort was made to move Galileo's remains to a more prominent location within the Basilica of Santa Croce. The initiative received support from influential figures, signalling a gradual easing of the ecclesiastical opposition that had once been so formidable. On March 12, 1737, a solemn ceremony took place. Galileo's coffin was exhumed from its humble resting place in the Chapel of Novices. During this process, some of his bones and teeth were removed by various individuals, a practice not uncommon at the time for relics of revered figures. His remains were then reinterred in a magnificent tomb located in the main body of the basilica, directly opposite the monument to Michelangelo. This new burial was a grand affair, complete with an elaborate marble mausoleum featuring a bust of Galileo and allegorical figures representing geometry and astronomy. It was a public and unambiguous declaration of his posthumous rehabilitation and an acknowledgement of his enduring legacy. This reburial was more than just a change of location. It was a symbolic act. It signified a profound shift in both public and, more subtly, ecclesiastical opinion regarding Galileo's contributions. While the Church's official condemnation was not immediately rescinded, the Grand Tomb in Santa Croce represented a cultural reconciliation, an acceptance that the man and his ideas could no longer be confined to obscurity. It marked the beginning of a long journey toward full rehabilitation, recognizing Galileo not as a heretic, but as a luminary of human intellect. The grand reburial of Galileo in Santa Croce in 1737 marked an important cultural shift, but it was by no means the final chapter in the complex relationship between Galileo's science and the Catholic Church. The formal process of reassessment, and a full acknowledgement of the historical circumstances, would prove to be a much longer and more intricate journey, spanning centuries. For generations after Galileo's death, his works, particularly those advocating for heliocentrism, remained on the Church's index of forbidden books. While scientific thought continued to advance and the Copernican model became widely accepted within the scientific community, the ecclesiastical pronouncements of 1616 and 1633 cast a long shadow. Scholars within the Church, however, did engage with Galileo's ideas, and the intellectual landscape was never static. The initial steps towards a more formal reconsideration came in the 18th century, with the gradual removal of books advocating heliocentrism from the index. However, a direct address of Galileo's personal condemnation remained elusive, and it was not until the 20th century that a more comprehensive and open re-evaluation began to take shape. Various scholars and theologians within the Church undertook studies of the Galileo affair, examining the historical context, the theological arguments, and the scientific evidence. These inquiries sought to understand the confluence of factors that led to the fateful trial and its aftermath, moving beyond simplistic narratives of conflict. The culmination of this centuries-long process arrived in 1992, under the pontificate of Pope John Paul II. After a lengthy investigation by a special commission, Pope John Paul II delivered a significant address on October 31, 1992, before the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. In this address, he formally acknowledged the Church's errors in the handling of Galileo's case, though he spoke of the tragic misunderstanding that occurred, recognizing that the theologians of the 17th century had failed to distinguish adequately between biblical interpretation and scientific inquiry. Pope John Paul II stated that Galileo had suffered unjustly, and that the condemnation was based on a subjective interpretation of Scripture, rather than on an objective scientific truth. This public declaration represented a profound moment of reconciliation, a formal recognition of the complexities of the past, and a testament to the Church's willingness to engage with historical self-reflection. It closed a chapter that had remained open for over 350 years, finally offering a definitive, albeit long-delayed, acknowledgement of the error. Despite the challenges and condemnations he faced in his lifetime, even and the long road to his posthumous rehabilitation, Galileo Galilei's influence on the course of human knowledge proved to be immeasurable. His contributions transcended the specific discoveries he made, fundamentally altering the way humanity sought to understand the natural world. It is for these profound shifts in methodology and philosophy that he is widely and rightly revered as the father of modern science. Galileo's enduring legacy rests significantly on his pioneering embrace of systematic observation and experimentation. Before him, natural philosophy often relied heavily on deductive reasoning from established texts and ancient authorities. Galileo, however, insisted on looking directly at nature, questioning assumptions and devising experiments to test hypotheses. His inclined plane experiments, in his careful measurements of falling objects, and his meticulous astronomical observations through the telescope, all exemplify this revolutionary approach. He did not merely describe phenomena, but sought to measure them, to quantify them. Furthermore, Galileo championed the idea that the universe could be understood through the language of mathematics. He asserted that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, a profound declaration that laid the groundwork for the mathematical physics that would follow. This belief in the mathematical order of the cosmos, combined with his empirical method, provided a powerful new framework for scientific inquiry. It moved science beyond qualitative descriptions towards precise, quantitative analysis, enabling predictions and verifiable theories. His advocacy for heliocentrism, while bringing him into direct conflict with the prevailing dogma, was a powerful testament to his commitment to following evidence wherever it led, even if it challenged long-held beliefs. He understood that true knowledge required intellectual freedom and a willingness to overturn established paradigms in the face of compelling data. Through his telescopic discoveries, he revealed a universe far more complex and dynamic than previously imagined, shattering ancient cosmological models and igniting a new era of astronomical exploration. His work on motion laid the groundwork for Isaac Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation, forming the bedrock of classical mechanics. In essence, Galileo provided humanity with not just answers, but with a new and infinitely more effective way of asking questions about the universe. His methodical approach, his insistence on empirical verification, and his belief in the mathematical intelligibility of nature continue to resonate, shaping scientific endeavour to this very day. His life, marked by both brilliant insight and profound struggle, ultimately forged a path for the scientific revolution that would transform the world. Among Galileo's many contributions, perhaps his most profound and enduring gift to humanity lies in his pivotal role in shaping what we now recognize as the scientific method. While no single individual can be credited with its sole invention, Galileo's work exemplified and solidified the crucial elements that form its bedrock. His approach was not merely a collection of isolated discoveries, but a coherent methodology that offered a powerful new pathway to knowledge. He moved beyond simple observation, elevating it to a systematic process. His use of the telescope was not just a glance at the heavens, but to meticulously record, sketch, and measure what he saw, seeking patterns and anomalies. This careful, structured observation provided the foundational data upon which theories could be built or challenged. Crucially, Galileo integrated experimentation into this process with unprecedented rigour. He understood that to truly comprehend natural phenomena, one must often manipulate conditions and create controlled situations. His famous thought experiments and actual physical experiments, such as those concerning falling bodies and pendulums, were designed to isolate variables and test specific hypotheses. This systematic testing of ideas against empirical evidence was a radical departure from earlier philosophical traditions that often prioritized abstract reasoning over direct observation of cause and effect. Furthermore, Galileo insisted on the indispensable role of mathematics in describing and understanding the natural world. For him, the universe was not a realm of qualitative descriptions, but of quantifiable relationships. He believed that the laws governing physical phenomena could be expressed with precision through mathematical equations. This integration of mathematical analysis provided a powerful tool for not only describing observations, but also for making predictions that could then be tested through further experimentation. The combination of these three elements, systematic observation, controlled experimentation, and rigorous mathematical analysis, formed the essential blueprint for the scientific method. It provided a framework for inquiry that was self-correcting, progressive, and capable of generating reliable knowledge. This method allowed for the systematic accumulation of understanding, moving science from a collection of isolated insights to a cumulative, collaborative enterprise. Galileo's lasting gift, therefore, was not just a set of astronomical or physical truths, but the very intellectual toolkit that humanity would use to uncover countless truths in the centuries that followed. It was a template for rational inquiry, a means by which humanity could consistently and reliably interrogate the cosmos, making his methodological legacy arguably more significant than any single discovery. Galileo Galilei occupies a singular position in the tapestry of intellectual history, serving as a crucial bridge between two distinct epochs of human understanding. He stood at the precipice where the ancient, largely Aristotelian worldview began to yield to a radically new, empirical and mathematical comprehension of the universe. His life and work embody this profound transition, marking the shift from an era defined by philosophical deduction to one driven by observation and measurement. For centuries, Western thought had been profoundly shaped by the teachings of Aristotle. This venerable framework, while comprehensive, often relied on qualitative descriptions, teleological explanations, and a hierarchical view of the cosmos that placed Earth at its stationary centre. But knowledge was frequently derived from logical argument and established authority, with less emphasis placed on direct systematic investigation of nature itself. The heavens were seen as perfect and unchanging, composed of an ethereal substance distinct from the terrestrial realm. Galileo, however, began to dismantle these long-held assumptions. Through his telescope, he saw imperfections on the Moon, phases of Venus, and moons orbiting Jupiter, observations that directly contradicted the Aristotelian notion of celestial perfection and the Earth-centered model. These empirical findings were not mere curiosities. They were direct challenges to a cosmological system that had been entrenched for over a millennium. His work on motion, too, represented a fundamental break. Instead of seeking the purpose of an object's movement, as Aristotle might, Galileo focused on how it moved, describing its trajectory and velocity with mathematical precision. He sought the underlying laws that governed motion, rather than its inherent qualities or final causes. This shift from why to how, from quality to quantity, was revolutionary. He was a transitional figure in the truest sense, not simply rejecting the old but actively forging the new. He didn't merely observe, he measured. He did not merely speculate, he experimented. He did not merely describe, he formulated mathematical relationships. In doing so, he helped to lay the foundations for a mechanistic universe, one governed by universal laws that could be discovered through careful observation, experimentation, and expressed through the language of mathematics. Galileo's enduring legacy is thus intertwined with this grand intellectual migration. He was a pioneer who guided humanity across the chasm, separating the old world of philosophical cosmology from the new world of empirical science, forever altering how we seek to understand the vast and intricate cosmos around us. As the long narrative of Galileo Galilei's life gently comes to its close, we are left with the quiet echoes of his profound impact. His journey, marked by both brilliant insight and profound struggle, ultimately underscores the enduring power of careful observation and persistent inquiry. It is in the patient gaze through a lens, the deliberate measurement of a falling object, and the meticulous recording of celestial movements that his true legacy resides. Galileo embodied a spirit of serene curiosity, yet a willingness to look closely at the world and accept what it revealed, even when those revelations challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. His was not a clamorous revolution, but a methodical unfolding of truth, one observation at a time. The whispers of the universe, once obscured by ancient doctrines, began to speak more clearly through his instruments and his intellect. His life reminds us that significant change often begins with simple, focused attention. The turning of a telescope toward the night sky, the simple act of rolling a ball down an inclined plane. These were not dramatic gestures, but quiet acts of engagement with the natural world. Yet, from these humble beginnings sprang an entirely new way of understanding our place within the vast cosmic order. Even in his final years, under the shadow of house arrest and the dimming light of his own vision, Galileo continued his intellectual work, dictating his thoughts and discoveries. This quiet perseverance, this unwavering dedication to the pursuit of knowledge despite adversity, speaks volumes about the intrinsic human drive to comprehend. The world he left behind was irrevocably altered by his presence. The stars he observed still shine, the laws of motion he described still govern, and the method of inquiry he championed continues to guide scientific exploration. His story is a testament to the quiet strength of intellectual courage and the transformative potential of seeing the world not as it is assumed to be, but as it truly reveals itself. May the gentle rhythm of his discoveries and the enduring calm of his scientific spirit bring a sense of peace. The echoes of his insights continue to resonate, inviting us all to look a little closer, to question a little deeper, and to find solace in the quiet unfolding of knowledge.